Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The studio smelled wrong from the first moment I stepped inside. Not bad exactly, just wrong. Like rain-soaked cedar left too long in the dark, or the inside of a closet that hadn't been opened in years. The kind of smell that makes you aware of your own breathing, makes you wonder what you're pulling into your lungs with each inhale. I'd found the place on a short-term rental site. Furnished, cheap, available immediately. Perfect for a month-long remote work stint in Seattle. The photos had shown exposed brick, tall windows, the kind of industrial chic aesthetic that usually costs twice what I was paying. I should have known better. The superintendent who let me in was a wiry man in his 60s, all sinew and silence. He handed me 2 keys without meeting my eyes, pointed to the bathroom, the kitchenette, the main room. When I asked about the bedroom door at the far end of the studio, the one with the old-fashioned keyhole and tarnished brass handle, he paused mid-gesture. "That stays closed," he said. I laughed. Nervous habit. "It's part of the rental, right? I mean, I paid for... That stays closed." His voice had gone flat, rehearsed, like he'd said these exact words before many times. Don't incommode the previous tenant. The phrasing stuck with me, not don't bother or don't disturb. Incommode, like the previous tenant was still here, still requiring consideration, still deserving of peace. I told myself it was a translation thing, that his English was fine, but sometimes the words came out strange. I told myself a lot of things that first day. By evening, I'd unpacked my laptop, arranged my clothes in the standing wardrobe, made coffee in the surprisingly well-stocked kitchenette. The studio was larger than it had looked in photos, the ceiling high enough to create echoes when I walked across the hardwood floor. The windows faced a narrow alley, bringing in gray light that seemed to drain color from everything it touched. Rain began to fall around 7. The kind of persistent Seattle drizzle that sounds like static, white noise that should be soothing but somehow isn't. I worked until midnight, finished a project proposal, sent emails, normal things, anchoring things, but my eyes kept drifting to that bedroom door. It was maybe 15 feet from where I'd set up my workspace. Old wood, dark with age or varnish, a vertical grain that caught the light in odd ways. The keyhole was the old-fashioned kind, large enough to peer through if you got close enough. Large enough for someone on the other side to peer back. I didn't look through it. Not that night. Instead, I pulled out the sofa bed, turned off all the lights except the small lamp by my laptop, and tried to sleep. The rain continued its static hiss. Somewhere in the building, pipes groaned and settled. Normal sounds, city sounds, nothing to worry about. At 3:13 a.m., the lock turned. I was awake instantly, that animal alertness that bypasses thought entirely. The sound was unmistakable. The heavy click of tumblers sliding, metal scraping against metal. Old mechanisms that resisted, then yielded. I lay frozen in the sofa bed, covers pulled to my chin like a child, staring at the bedroom door through the darkness. The handle didn't turn, the door didn't open, but something was breathing on the other side. Slow, wet breaths. The kind you hear when someone has a cold, congestion rattling in their chest. In and out, in and out. Patient, waiting. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Just listened to that horrible liquid breathing pressed against the wood, so close I could hear the slight whistle in the exhale. How long did I lie there? 5 minutes? 20? Time had gone strange. Elastic. Eventually, the breathing stopped. The lock clicked again, tumblers sliding home. Silence. I told myself I'd dreamed it. Half-asleep confusion, jet lag from the cross-country flight, stress from the project deadline. The mind plays tricks in unfamiliar places. Everyone knows this. Everyone has woken in a hotel room disoriented, convinced for a moment that they're somewhere, someone else entirely. But when morning came and I approached the door, I saw the handprints. They were on the inside of the door, I could see them through the gap at the bottom, the space where the wood didn't quite meet the frame. Wet marks, like someone had pressed their palms flat against the interior surface. 5 fingers each, too distinct to be tricks of shadow or wood grain. The prints were large, larger than my own hands. They glistened slightly in the gray morning light filtering through the windows, as if they were still damp. I called the superintendent. He didn't answer. I sent an email to the rental company. Auto reply, office closed for renovations. Check back next week. Of course, I spent that day trying to work, trying to focus on spreadsheets and conference calls, but my attention kept fracturing. The bedroom door seemed to pull at my peripheral vision, demanding attention even when I faced away from it. The smell of rain and cold wood grew stronger as the day progressed, though the weather outside had cleared to pale sunshine. By evening, I developed a headache, the kind that sits behind your eyes and makes everything slightly unreal. That night, I did something I knew was foolish, even as I did it. I set up my phone to record audio while I slept, positioned on the floor between my makeshift bed and the door. If something happened again, I'd have proof, evidence, something concrete to show the superintendent, the rental company, myself. At 3:13 a.m., the lock turned again. This time I was ready for it, or thought I was. I kept my eyes open, watching the door through the darkness. The breathing started immediately, that wet, congested sound, but now I could hear more. A slight scraping, like fingernails dragging across wood from the inside. Not scratching to get out. More like tracing, following the grain, exploring the surface with touch. Then barely audible beneath the breathing. Stay. My heart stopped. Literally felt like it stopped. A gap in the rhythm that made me gasp. The word was spoken, whispered, in a voice like water over gravel, damaged and wrong. Not a question, not a command, just a statement of fact, or perhaps a wish. Stay. I couldn't have moved if I'd wanted to. Terror had turned my muscles to stone, my thoughts to white noise. The breathing continued for another minute, maybe 2. Then the lock clicked, and silence returned, like a held breath finally released. I didn't check the recording until sunrise. Couldn't bring myself to do it in the dark. When I finally played it back, my hands were shaking enough to make the phone screen dance. Most of the file was just ambient sound. My own breathing, the building settling, distant traffic. But at exactly 3:13 a.m., there it was. The lock, the breathing, even more visceral on the recording, wet and labored. The scraping. And then my own voice, clear as day. I know you're there. Except I hadn't said that. I'd said nothing. I'd been frozen, silent, terrified. Yet there it was. Unmistakably my voice, my inflection, speaking words I never spoke. I played it again, and again. Each time my recorded voice said the same thing. I know you're there. Conversational, almost friendly. Like I was greeting someone I recognized. The rational part of my brain, the part that still functioned, that hadn't been subsumed by primal dread, tried to make sense of it. Sleep talking maybe, some kind of audio glitch, interference from another device. But I knew, somewhere deeper than rational thought, that none of these explanations fit. The timestamp was exact, the voice was too clear, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I hadn't spoken. Something was using my voice, or I was becoming something else, or there had never been a difference to begin with. That afternoon, I finally encountered another tenant in the hallway, a woman in her 40s carrying groceries. I asked her, trying to sound casual, if she knew anything about the studio I was renting, about its history, about previous tenants. Her face went carefully blank. "You should leave," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the wall behind me. "People don't stay long in that unit." "Why? What happened?" She shook her head, already moving away. "Just leave. Before you can't anymore. Before I can't anymore." The phrasing echoed in my head all afternoon, suggesting not just choice, but capability. As if staying too long changed something fundamental, made departure impossible. I told myself I'd leave, pack up, forfeit the deposit, find a hotel. Simple, Easy. But I didn't leave. Instead, that evening, I did something that felt both insane and inevitable. I acknowledged it. The presence. The thing. Whatever was behind that door. I left the hallway light on. The door of the studio barely illuminated it, but it was something. A gesture. And I filled a glass with water, placed it on the floor in front of the bedroom door. An offering. Or maybe a test. I don't know what I expected. Maybe nothing. Maybe for it to still be there in the morning. Proof that I'd imagined everything. That would have been better in its way. Confirmation of madness is sometimes preferable to confirmation of the alternative. By morning, the glass was half full of mud. Not dirty water. Not cloudy or discolored. Actual mud, thick and dark, with particles suspended in it like sediment from a river bottom. The kind of mud you'd find in deep places, old places, where things settle and decompose slowly in the absence of light. It even smelled like deep earth, mineral and cold. I stared at it for a long time, crouched on the floor, close enough to see my reflection in the surface. The face looking back seemed different somehow, though I couldn't identify what had changed. The eyes, maybe. Something about the eyes. The handprints on the inside of the door were gone, or rather, had moved. Now they were higher up, pressed against the wood at roughly head height, as if whatever made them had been standing, leaning forward, listening. I should have left then. Packed my laptop, grabbed my suitcase, walked out the door and never looked back. That's what any sensible person would have done. But something had shifted inside me, some fundamental reorientation of priority. The fear was still there. If anything, it had grown, become a constant pressure in my chest, a weight that made breathing difficult. But alongside it was something else. Curiosity, maybe, or recognition. The thing behind the door knew me, had spoken with my voice, and some terrible part of me wanted to know more, needed to understand what was happening, even if understanding destroyed me. That night, I didn't set up a recording. Instead, I sat on the floor, back against the wall opposite the bedroom door, and waited. The studio lights were off except for that single hallway bulb, its weak glow barely reaching my position. Rain had started again, harder this time, drumming against the windows with an urgency that felt almost angry. 3:13 a.m. came with a precision that felt cosmic, inevitable. The lock turned. The breathing started, but this time, the door opened. Not all the way. Just a crack, maybe 3 inches, enough to let out a wave of that cold, wet smell. The smell of deep water and older darkness, of places where the sun never reaches. Through the gap, I could see nothing but black, a darkness so complete it seemed to have texture, weight. And then, barely visible in the ambient light, something pale extended from that darkness. A hand, waterlogged and wrinkled, like skin that's been submerged too long, fingers too long and too thin, reaching toward the glass I'd left. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, could barely think through the static that had replaced my thoughts. The hand grasped the glass with a delicacy that seemed wrong, almost careful, and pulled it back through the gap. The door closed. The lock clicked. Silence, except for the rain and my own ragged breathing. In the morning, the glass was back, positioned exactly where I'd placed it. Empty now, but there was something inside, a small object I hadn't put there. I approached slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, to leave, to never come back. It was a key. Old brass, tarnished green with age, the kind that would fit the bedroom door's old-fashioned lock. There was no note, no explanation, just the key, sitting in the bottom of the glass like a promise or a threat or an invitation. I picked it up. The metal was cold, unnaturally so, cold enough to sting my palm. In the better light of morning, I could see an engraving on the shaft, nearly worn away by time. 404. This was Unit 404. My unit. The previous tenant, the superintendent had said. Don't incommode the previous tenant. I looked at the bedroom door, at the keyhole, at the space between door and frame where I'd seen those handprints. The rational part of my brain was screaming now. a constant alarm I'd learned to ignore. What was rationality anyway in the face of this? What use was logic when reality itself had become negotiable? I could leave. The door to the hallway was right there, unlocked, easy. I could pack in 10 minutes, be gone in 15. Find somewhere else to work for the next 3 weeks. Somewhere normal, somewhere safe, somewhere that didn't breathe and reach and use my voice to say things I never said. Instead, I walked to the bedroom door, stood in front of it, key in hand. Through the wood, I thought I could hear breathing, soft and patient, waiting. The key fit perfectly. Of course it did. The lock turned with surprising ease, tumblers sliding like they'd been oiled recently. The handle was cold under my palm, wet somehow, as if it had been underwater moments before. I pulled the door open. The bedroom was smaller than I expected, maybe 8 by 10, barely large enough for the single bed and nightstand inside. The walls were water-stained, dark blooms of mold spreading across old wallpaper. The window was covered with heavy curtains, no light getting through. But the smell, that smell of rain and cold in deep places, was overwhelming, so thick I could taste it. And on the bed, there were imprints, body-shaped depressions in the mattress, as if someone had been lying there moments ago. The sheets were damp, darkened with water or something like water. On the nightstand sat a glass half full of mud, identical to the one I'd left outside, and pinned to the wall above the bed I saw photographs. Dozens of them, overlapping, creating a collage that covered nearly the entire surface. My heart seized when I recognized them. They were all of me. Me arriving at the building that first day, seen from above. Me at my laptop, captured through the window. Me sleeping on the sofa bed, unaware. Me in the hallway, talking to the woman with groceries. Me standing exactly where I was standing now, looking at these same photographs. An infinite regression that made my head spin. But in each photo, there was something else. A figure in the background, barely visible, water-damaged and unclear. In the doorway, by the window, behind my chair. Always there, always watching, always too blurred to identify clearly. Always the same size and shape as me. I don't know how long I stood there staring at those photographs, trying to understand. Time had gone strange again, elastic and uncertain. The breathing behind me, when it had moved behind me, grew louder, more insistent. I turned slowly, knowing what I'd see, unable to stop myself. The doorway was empty. The studio beyond was dark, though I'd left lights on. And in the darkness, barely visible, something moved. Something pale and waterlogged, with my face, my features, my eyes. It smiled with my mouth. "Stay," it said, with my voice. Not a request, a reminder. "You already have." I tried to move, to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't respond. Or maybe it was responding, just not to me. My legs carried me backward, to the bed. My hands pulled back the damp sheets. My voice spoke words I didn't choose. I understand now. And the terrible thing was, I did understand. Or some part of me did. The part that had been growing since I'd first opened that door. That had been listening to the breathing. That had left the offering. The part that recognized the figure in the photographs. The hand taking the glass. The voice in the recording. The previous tenant hadn't left. Hadn't gone anywhere at all. The previous tenant was still here, had always been here, would always be here. Becoming part of the room, part of the walls, part of the water, and the darkness, and the cold. And now, so was I. I'm writing this in the morning, or what I think is morning. Light comes through the windows, but it seems thin, unconvincing. The superintendent hasn't responded to my messages. The rental company's email still bounces back. The woman in the hallway doesn't exist in any tenant registry I can find online. I've tried to leave, packed my bags 3 times, but I never make it past the door. Something always stops me. A sound, a smell, a memory that isn't mine. My hand on the handle, refusing to turn it. My voice saying stay when I mean to say go. The bedroom door is open now. I leave it that way. Sometimes I sleep in there. on those damp sheets, breathing that smell of rain and cold in deep places. It's not so bad, really, almost comfortable in its way. At 3:13 a.m., the lock still turns, habit or ritual or echo, but I don't need to listen through the door anymore. I am the door. I am the breathing. I am the handprints on the wood, the mud in the glass, the figure in the photographs. Last night I heard footsteps in the hallway. Someone new arriving, keys jingling, suitcase wheels bumping over the threshold. Fresh meat, another month-long rental, another tenant who found the price too good, the availability too convenient. I pressed my hands against the inside of the door, left them there, damp and patient. Through the wood, I could hear them unpacking, settling in, establishing their space, making it home. Soon, they'll see the bedroom door, wonder about it, ask questions the superintendent won't answer, and eventually, late one night when they can't sleep, when their curiosity or fear or need to know overwhelms their common sense, they'll look through the keyhole. I'll be waiting on the other side, looking back, my eyes, their face, becoming. The previous tenant never left. The previous tenant can't leave. The previous tenant is patient, and there's always room for one more. Story 2. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither does solitude. I took the security job at the abandoned salt depot 3 miles south of Salton Sea because I needed the isolation more than the money. The company, some faceless LLC managing foreclosed properties, needed someone to watch over 40,000 square feet of corrugated metal and crystalline memories for 6 weeks while they sorted out the paperwork. Easy money. No one around for miles except the occasional coyote and the wind that never quite stops whispering across the flats. The depot squatted against the horizon like a rust-colored tomb, its walls streaked with mineral deposits that caught the moonlight and made the whole structure seem to breathe in the darkness. Inside, the air tasted of ancient brine and something else, something that clung to the back of my throat like a warning I couldn't quite translate. My living quarters consisted of a metal bunk in the corner of the main warehouse, a camping stove, and a chemical toilet behind a privacy screen that did nothing to preserve dignity. The company had provided a basic security kit, flashlight, radio that barely worked, and a logbook where I was supposed to record my nightly rounds. The pages were blank, except for the first entry, written in handwriting that wasn't mine. Checked the northwest corner twice. I didn't think much of it that first week. Previous guard probably had his reasons. The isolation settled over me like sediment in still water. During the day, I'd walk the perimeter, kicking at salt formations that crunched beneath my boots like bone. The landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, flat, alkaline, hostile to life. At night, the temperature dropped 30 degrees, and the metal walls contracted with sounds that could have been groaning or could have been something else entirely. On the 8th night, I couldn't sleep. The insomnia wasn't new. I'd been carrying it with me for months, part of the baggage I'd hoped to shed out here in the nothing. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up pretending and decided to mark the floor. I'd found 5-pound bags of refined salt crystals stacked in the storage area, probably forgotten inventory. I tore one open and spent an hour spreading a thin layer of white powder across the concrete floor, creating a pale carpet that covered the main warehouse space. If anything moved through here, rats, vagrant, whatever, I'd know about it. The salt caught the beam of my flashlight and turned the warehouse floor into a strange, luminous plain, like I was standing on frozen moonlight. I climbed back into my bunk, positioned near the eastern wall where I could see most of the warehouse floor. The metal frame creaked beneath my weight. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion has its own gravity, and I must have drifted off sometime before 3. I woke to silence so complete it felt aggressive. My watch read 2:47 a.m., which meant I'd been out for maybe 40 minutes. I lay there, that particular alertness that comes from interrupted sleep making every sense hyper-aware. The warehouse was dark except for the emergency exit sign near the loading dock, its red glow barely penetrating the shadows. I could see the salt-covered floor, still pristine and undisturbed. Then I noticed the footprints. They started approximately 6 feet from my bunk, not beside it, but 6 feet away, as if someone had simply materialized mid-stride. The impressions moved through the salt in a straight line toward the main door, then curved back, passing within 3 feet of where I lay. They continued to the northwest corner, the corner the previous guard had mentioned, before returning in a meandering pattern that suggested aimless wandering. But I hadn't heard anything. Not a footstep, not a breath, not the whisper of fabric against skin. I lay frozen in my bunk for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The footprints were clearly visible in the salt, each impression showing the ball of the foot bearing more weight than the heel, as if whoever made them had been walking carefully, or dragging themselves forward with immense effort. When my heart finally slowed enough for me to move, I grabbed my flashlight and examined the prints more closely. They were roughly my size, men's 10 or 11, and the stride length suggested someone my height. The pattern was wrong, though, too deliberate, too purposeful for a random intruder, too aimless for someone with an objective. I checked every door, every window, all locked from the inside, exactly as I'd left them. The next morning, I told myself it had been me. Sleepwalking, maybe. The isolation getting under my skin already. I'd heard about it happening to people in solitary conditions, the mind playing tricks, filling the void with phantom sensations and false memories. I swept up the salt and tried to forget about it, but the next night, I spread the salt again. This time I positioned my bunk differently, dragging it to the center of the warehouse floor, where I'd have a 360-degree view. I set up my phone on a stack of supply crates, aimed at the empty space around me, and hit record. The battery would last maybe 4 hours. Good enough. Sleep came harder this time. I lay in the darkness, listening to every creak and groan of the building settling, every distant sound that might have been wind, or might have been footsteps approaching across the desert floor. My eyes kept drifting to the pale expanse of salt surrounding my bunk like a moat around a castle that wouldn't protect anyone from anything. At 2:47 a.m., I know because I was staring at my watch when it happened, I heard nothing. But in my peripheral vision, I saw the salt compress. It started near the loading dock and moved toward me in a steady rhythm. Step, step, step. Each footprint appeared as if pressed by invisible weight, the salt crystals compacting and darkening where something bore down on them. The pattern was the same as before, approaching my bunk, circling it once, then moving away toward the northwest corner. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I did neither. Instead, I lay there, barely breathing, watching the impossible happen with the kind of cold clarity that comes when your mind can't process what your eyes are showing you. The footprints continued their circuit, back toward my bunk, around it again, then a slow shuffle toward the eastern wall where my bunk had been the night before. Whatever was making those prints seemed tired. The stride length shortened with each step, the impressions deeper, as if the invisible weight was increasing, or as if whatever made them was growing weaker. The footprints stopped approximately 3 feet from where I lay. I could see the final impression clearly, the way the salt had compressed under the ball of the foot, the slight drag mark where toes had scraped forward through the powder. Then nothing. No retreat, no continuation. Just that single footprint pointed directly at me, as if whatever made it had stopped to stare. I don't know how long I lay there. Long enough for my muscles to cramp. Long enough for the emergency exit light to seem like a lighthouse in a vast, hostile dark. When dawn finally leaked through the high windows, painting the warehouse in shades of gray that eventually brightened to morning, I checked my phone. The recording showed exactly what I'd seen. Salt compressing under nothing, footprints appearing in a steady rhythm while I lay motionless in my bunk, paralyzed by something between terror and fascination. I played it back 6 times. Each viewing made it less believable and more real simultaneously. On the 3rd night, I didn't spread the salt. Instead, I spent the evening examining the northwest corner, the place the footprints seemed drawn to repeatedly. The area appeared identical to every other section of the warehouse. Concrete floor, corrugated metal walls, wooden pallets stacked with ancient equipment covered in dust and mineral deposits. But there was something about the way shadows gathered there, even in daylight. Something that made my eyes want to slide away, to focus on anything else. I found the scratches around 10 p.m. They were on the wall, approximately 5 feet up, hidden behind a stack of deteriorating cardboard boxes that I'd moved aside. At first, they looked random, just gouges in the metal, the kind that accumulate in any industrial space over decades. But when I angled my flashlight correctly, patterns emerged. Numbers, coordinates, times, 33, 2,397 degrees north, 115, 8,372 degrees west, 0247, 33, 2,397 degrees north, 115 degrees 83 minutes 72 seconds west, 0 degrees 24 minutes 33 seconds, 2,397 degrees north, 115 degrees 83 minutes 72 seconds west, 0247. The same coordinates repeated dozens of times, scratched into the metal with what must have been tremendous force. The numbers had been carved deep, the metal curled back in sharp edges that would have required either a specialized tool or desperate strength, and always the same time, 2:47. I pulled out my phone and entered the coordinates into the map application. The location marker appeared roughly 200 yards southwest of the depot, in what looked like empty desert on the satellite view. But the image was old. The depot itself barely showed up, just a gray smudge against the pale ground. The wind picked up outside, howling across the flats with a sound like distant voices. I stood there in that corner, my flashlight beam reflecting off the scratched numbers, and felt the weight of understanding settling over me like cold water. Someone had been here before me. Someone who had seen what I was seeing. And they'd tried to leave a message. I could have called it in. Should have. Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and walked out into the desert. The night was clear, the stars so bright they seemed to generate their own sound. A high, cold ringing that might have been tinnitus, or might have been the universe itself, humming. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating patches of cracked earth and salt formations that looked like frozen waves. 200 yards felt like 2 miles. Each step took me further from the dubious safety of the depot and deeper into darkness that seemed somehow alive, somehow aware of my presence. The beam of my flashlight caught something ahead, a shape that didn't belong to the natural landscape. The office trailer was half buried in sand and salt deposits, tilted at a 15-degree angle, as if the ground beneath it had given way on one side. It was old, decades old, the kind of mobile unit construction companies used before regulations and safety standards caught up with convenience. The door hung partially open, revealing darkness that my light couldn't fully penetrate. Someone had welded the door shut from the outside. I could see the seams of melted metal, crude but effective, creating a seal that had only recently failed. The metal had corroded through at the bottom hinge, allowing the door to sag open just enough for a determined person to squeeze through. I should have turned back. Every survival instinct I possessed was screaming at me to return to the depot, to pack my few belongings, and to drive away without looking back. But the scratches on the wall had mentioned this place, had pointed me here with the desperate certainty of a drowning man indicating shore. Inside, the trailer smelled of rust and something organic that had long since desiccated into dust. My flashlight revealed a Spartan space, desk, chair, filing cabinet, and, impossibly, a radio still drawing power from somewhere, its dial glowing faint green in the darkness. The radio was broadcasting, not music or news, but voices. Static-laden and distant, they overlapped and echoed, creating a soundscape that was almost but not quite comprehensible. I caught fragments, second shift reports, Northwest storage compromised, evacuation protocols, he's still there. The voices weren't coming from the radio's speaker. They were coming from the air itself, as if the trailer existed in some pocket dimension where past broadcasts had been trapped, endlessly cycling through the same desperate communications. On the desk, partially buried under 30 years of dust, I found a security badge. The photo showed a man approximately my age, my height, my build. The name was obscured by water damage, but the ID number was clearly visible. I pulled my own badge from my pocket, the one the company had issued me 3 weeks ago, and compared them. The numbers were identical. My hands started shaking. I set both badges on the desk side by side, my flashlight beam illuminating them like exhibits in a museum of impossible things. The photo on the old badge stared up at me with eyes that could have been mine, wearing an expression I'd seen in my own mirror, the hollow look of someone who'd accepted isolation as punishment and penance. I picked up the old badge, and the door behind me swung fully open. The wind should have done it. That's what I told myself. Just wind, just physics, just the natural movement of a broken door in the desert night. But the air inside the trailer had been perfectly still. I spun around, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, and saw nothing. Just the open doorway and the desert beyond, stretching away into infinite darkness. But I could feel it, that same presence I'd sensed in the warehouse, the weight of invisible attention, the sensation of being observed by something that existed just slightly adjacent to the world I could perceive. The radio voices grew louder, more insistent. He doesn't know. Repeating pattern. Can't leave. 2:47. I ran. My flashlight beam jerked wildly as I sprinted across the desert floor, my boots crunching through salt formations and cracked earth. Behind me, the trailer seemed to pulse with green light from the radio, casting my shadow ahead of me in elongated, impossible shapes. I didn't look back. Looking back felt like it would confirm something I wasn't ready to acknowledge. The depot loomed ahead, its corrugated walls catching moonlight like a promise of sanctuary that I knew was false. I burst through the main door, slammed it behind me, and stood there gasping in the darkness of the warehouse. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. My bunk in the center of the floor, the emergency exit light glowing red, the shadows gathering in familiar patterns. Except now I knew what the northwest corner was pointing toward. Now I understood that the footprints weren't coming from outside. They were coming from me. I looked down at my right hand, still clutching the old security badge. The plastic was warm, as if it had been recently worn, as if it had never stopped being worn. The photo stared up at me, and in the dim light of the warehouse, I could see details I'd missed before. The background wasn't a neutral studio backdrop. It was the interior of the depot, visible behind the man's shoulder. My depot. This depot. And on the wall behind him, barely visible in the photo, I could see scratches, numbers and coordinates, carved into metal with desperate force. My phone showed 2:43 a.m. I walked to the northwest corner, to the spot where the footprints always seemed to end. In the darkness, the wall looked different than it had during the day. The shadows didn't fall the way they should. They gathered and pooled, creating patches of darkness that seemed deeper than mere absence of light. I raised my hand and pressed it against the cold metal. The wall felt wrong, too thin, too hollow, as if there was vast empty space behind it instead of desert and night. When I pulled my hand away, I saw the faint outline of my palm print, not in dust or condensation, but pressed into the metal itself, as if the wall had momentarily softened under my touch. 2:45 a.m. The footprints had always stopped here. The scratched coordinates pointed here. The old badge had been waiting here. Everything had been leading to this moment, this place, this understanding that was trying to surface through layers of denial and rationalization. I pulled out my keys and scraped a small mark into the wall. The metal parted easily, more easily than it should have. I carved the date. Then, almost without thinking, I carved the time. 2:47 a.m. The radio in the trailer started broadcasting again, but now I could hear it here, in the warehouse, as if distance had become meaningless. The voices were clearer. Security checkpoint. Continuous monitoring. He hasn't figured it out yet. He will. They always do. I turned around and saw the salt. I hadn't spread it tonight. I was certain I hadn't. But there it was, covering the warehouse floor in a perfect luminous layer, and in that layer I could see footprints. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Overlapping and circling, all converging on the spot where I stood, all of them appearing as I watched. My footprints, my stride length, my weight, each one manifesting in the salt as I stood perfectly still, as the clock ticked toward 2:47, as the understanding finally broke through the surface of my consciousness like something drowning in reverse. I wasn't watching over the depot. The depot was watching over me. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and opened the camera. When I turned it to face myself, the screen showed the warehouse behind me, the salt-covered floor, the emergency exit light. But I wasn't in the frame. The camera showed empty space where I should have been standing. Just another set of footprints appearing in the salt, pressed down by nothing, going nowhere. The old security badge in my hand felt heavy. I looked at the photo again, at the man who could have been me, or could have been the guard before me, or could have been the guard before him. How many of us had there been? How many had stood in this exact spot at this exact time, trying to understand what the previous one had tried to warn them about? The scratches on the wall weren't a warning. They were a record, a tally mark, a desperate attempt to leave evidence that we'd existed, that we'd been here, that we'd understood too late. I raised my hand and carved another set of coordinates beneath the others. The same location, the same time, adding my mark to the accumulated evidence of however many had come before. 2:47 a.m. The footprints stopped appearing. The warehouse fell silent. Even the desert wind outside seemed to hold its breath. I stood there in the northwest corner, my hand pressed against the scarred metal wall, feeling it pulse with something that might have been my own heartbeat, or might have been the combined rhythm of all the others who had stood here before me. The security badge felt warm in my pocket, indistinguishable now from my own. Tomorrow I would wake up in my bunk. I would make coffee on the camping stove. I would walk the perimeter and check the locks and write in the logbook. And tomorrow night, at 2:47 a.m., I would wake up and see footprints in salt I didn't remember spreading, and I would try to figure out what they meant. And eventually, I would find the scratches on the wall pointing me toward an office I wouldn't quite remember visiting before. The company would send another guard in 6 weeks, someone who needed isolation, who was running from something, who wouldn't ask too many questions about why a security job in the middle of nowhere paid so well. And I would exist in the moments between their awareness, walking circuits through salt dust, carving warnings they wouldn't understand, becoming one more layer in whatever this place was accumulating. I pulled out my phone one last time and recorded a message to myself. Checked the northwest corner twice. Then I climbed into my bunk and waited for morning, knowing that when it came, I wouldn't quite remember the night before, knowing that the cycle would continue, knowing that somewhere in this building, in this moment, in this perpetual 2:47 a.m., I was still standing in that corner, my hand pressed against the wall, understanding and forgetting and understanding again. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither does solitude. But sometimes, if you listen carefully to the wind across the salt flats, you can hear the echoes of all the others who learned that truth too late, still walking their rounds, still checking the locks, still trying to warn whoever comes next about something they can't quite remember but can never truly forget. Story 3. The neon sign outside the Pineview Motor Lodge flickered against the darkening Colorado sky, casting irregular shadows across the gravel parking lot. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, my eyes burning from the endless stretch of Interstate 70, and this place was the first accommodation I'd seen in 40 miles. The building sagged slightly in the middle, its turquoise paint peeling in long strips that reminded me of dead skin. Inside, the lobby smelled of cigarettes and industrial cleaner, attempting to mask something older and more organic beneath. The man behind the desk looked up from a small television playing static-heavy local news. He was perhaps 60, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent too many years in places exactly like this one. "Need a room for the night," I said, setting my wallet on the counter. He slid a registration card across without a word, his fingernails yellowed and ridged. I filled it out with my cramped handwriting, the ballpoint pen skipping across the cheap paper. When I pushed it back, he studied it longer than seemed necessary, his lips moving slightly as if reading something more complex than a name and license plate number. "Room 12, he said finally, producing a physical key attached to a diamond-shaped plastic tag. The metal was warm in my palm, as though someone had been holding it moments before. "Good room." Quiet. I turned to leave, but his voice stopped me at the door. "Don't open the connecting door." I looked back. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between concern and careful neutrality. "What connecting door?" "Between 12 and 11. It's locked on your side. Keep it that way." He returned his attention to the television. The conversation apparently concluded. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, lit by fluorescent tubes that hummed with electrical interference. Room 12 was at the far end, and I could see room 11's door directly beside it, identical except for the tarnished brass numbers. Standing there with my duffel bag cutting into my shoulder, I noticed the gap beneath 11's door was completely dark. No light, no sound, nothing to indicate anyone inside. My room was exactly what I expected. A queen bed with a floral comforter that had seen better decades, a television bolted to a pressboard dresser, a bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. And there, on the wall opposite the bed, was the connecting door. It was painted the same institutional beige as the walls, with a deadbolt and chain on my side. I tested the handle without thinking. Locked, as promised. The window overlooked the parking lot and the mountains beyond, their peaks just visible against the deepening night. I counted 7 cars below, scattered across the white-lined spaces. Mine was the only one parked near the building's west end. The rest clustered near the lobby, as if the other guests had unconsciously sought proximity to other people. I showered in water that took 5 minutes to turn lukewarm, then lay on the bed in my clothes, too exhausted to care about proper sleep hygiene. The television offered 12 channels, half of them snow. I settled on a rerun of a game show from the 80s, the canned laughter oddly soothing in its predictability. My eyes were closing when I checked my phone one last time. 11:47 p.m. I set an alarm for 7 and let sleep take me. The sound came at 4:10 a.m. exactly, because that was the time glowing on the bedside clock when my eyes opened. Television static, but not from my TV, which I'd turned off before sleeping. This was coming from the other side of the connecting door, that familiar white noise hiss amplified through cheap walls. I lay perfectly still, listening, telling myself it was nothing. Just another guest who couldn't sleep and needed the background noise. Then the wall began to vibrate. Not shaking, not rattling. Vibrating, like someone had pressed their face against the other side and was humming or speaking so low that only the physical resonance carried through the drywall and paint. I could feel it through the pillow, a barely perceptible tremor that seemed to match the rhythm of speech, of syllables forming and dissolving. I should have rolled over, should have put my own television on and drowned it out. Instead, I found myself standing, walking toward that door, pressing my own ear against the cold paint. The vibration stopped immediately. In the new silence, I could hear my heartbeat, could hear the hum of the vending machine somewhere below, could hear a semi passing on the distant interstate, but nothing from room 11. I stepped back, suddenly aware of how thin I was, standing there in the darkness in just my t-shirt and jeans, barefoot on the rough carpet. "Hello?" The word left my mouth before I'd decided to speak. The static from the television next door lowered its volume just a fraction. Not off, not significantly quieter, just enough to suggest someone had touched the remote. Enough to suggest someone was listening. "Is everything all right over there?" Nothing. Then, after a pause that might have been 5 seconds or 50, my own voice came back through the wall. Not an echo, not quite. The words were mine, the inflection was mine, but they were delayed, stretched, playing back like audio from a cassette with worn tape. "Is everything all right over there?" My skin went cold. I backed away from the door, my breath coming faster, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. The television, obviously. Some audio loop, some technical glitch. The guest in 11 had a laptop maybe, was playing something, had the audio settings wrong. There were a dozen explanations, each one reasonable and sane, and insufficient to explain the exact replication of my timbre, my hesitation, my inflection on the word, all right. I turned on every light in the room, ceiling light, bathroom light, the lamp on the nightstand. I sat on the bed with my back against the headboard and stared at that connecting door until the wood grain started to form faces in my peripheral vision. The static continued next door, constant now, neither increasing nor decreasing, just that endless white noise that could hide any number of other sounds within its frequencies. At 5:30, with gray light beginning to outline the curtains, I finally stood. I needed to know. Needed to prove to myself that this was nothing, that I was tired and jumpy from too many hours driving through empty landscape. I put on my shoes and stepped into the hallway. Room 11's door looked identical to mine. Same scuffed paint, same peephole, same privacy placard hanging from the handle. This one read, "Do not disturb," in faded red letters. I stood there, hand raised to knock, suddenly unsure what I'd say if someone answered. What did you ask someone who might have recorded your voice and played it back through the wall at 4 a.m? My knuckles never made contact. The door was cold enough under my hand that I could feel it through the wood, like standing near an open freezer. I lowered my fist and instead leaned close, listening. The television was still going. That same static, that same volume. But beneath it, or within it, I could hear something else. Breathing, maybe. The particular rhythm of someone sleeping. I told myself this was good. This was normal. This meant whoever was in there was just a restless sleeper with their TV on for comfort. Nothing more sinister than that. I returned to my room and started packing. The sun was coming up properly now, turning the mountains pink and gold. And I wanted to be gone before I had to see the person in room 11 in daylight. Some instinct, some primal part of my brain insisted that seeing their face would be worse than not knowing. The desk clerk from the previous night was still there, or perhaps back already, sitting in the same position watching the same television. I set the key on the counter with more force than I intended. "Everything all right?" he asked, looking up with those same unreadable eyes. "Fine. Just need to settle up and get back on the road." He tapped at an ancient computer, the keys clicking with mechanical precision. "You're already paid through. Checked in yesterday at 3:15 p.m. No, I checked in last night, around 9. He turned the monitor toward me. There, in a database that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 90s, was my name, my license plate number, my credit card information. Check-in time, 3:15 p.m. Room 11. "That's wrong," I said, but my voice had gone thin. "I'm in room 12. You gave me room 12. He reached beneath the counter and produced a large ledger, the kind of thing that should have been obsolete decades ago, bound in green canvas with yellowed pages. He opened it to a marked page and turned it toward me. The handwriting was old-fashioned, careful, each entry logged with date and time. Yesterday's date. Room 11. My name, in handwriting that looked uncomfortably like my own cramped style, the way the G looped, the way the T crossed. Today's date. Room 12. My name again, same handwriting, same pen pressure. "I don't understand," I said, but I was already backing toward the door, my duffel bag suddenly heavy on my shoulder. "Happens sometimes," he said quietly, closing the ledger. "People show up twice, check into 11, then show up again and check into 12. Always the same sequence." He looked at me with something that might have been pity. Always the connecting door between them. "That's not possible." "No," he agreed. "It's not." I was in my car before I could process what I was doing, engine running, gravel spraying as I accelerated toward the interstate. In the rearview mirror, the Pine View Motor Lodge grew smaller, that flickering neon sign still visible even in the morning light. I didn't look up at the second floor. Didn't check to see if anyone was standing at the window of room 11, watching me leave. But 5 miles down the road, when I pulled over to catch my breath and calm my shaking hands, I opened the glove compartment looking for napkins and found the room key instead. The diamond-shaped plastic tag read, "Room 11," in those same tarnished brass numbers. I threw it into the scrub brush beside the highway and drove until the tank was nearly empty, until I found a gas station with bright lights and other people and the comfortable normalcy of convenience store coffee. I filled up, bought a sandwich I couldn't eat, and stood in the bathroom splashing water on my face. The mirror showed exactly what I expected. Tired eyes, 2 days of stubble, the lines of a long drive etched into my face. But when I looked down at my hands gripping the sink, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On my right palm, pressed into the skin like I'd been holding it for hours, was the impression of a key. The diamond shape was clearly visible, and if I looked closely I could still see the reversed imprint of brass numbers. 11. 3 days later, I was still driving. North, then west, then south again, following routes that kept me on major highways with frequent services. I checked into chain hotels with lobbies full of business travelers, places where the rooms had electronic locks and the walls were thick enough that you couldn't hear your neighbors breathe. But twice now, I've woken at 4:10 a.m. to the sound of television static that isn't coming from my set. And once, in a Holiday Inn outside of Salt Lake City, I found "Do Not Disturb" printed on the complimentary notepad on my desk, in handwriting I didn't remember making, but recognized as unmistakably mine. The mark on my palm has faded, but never entirely disappeared. In certain lights I can still see it, that diamond shape and those numbers. And I've started noticing other things. The way I sometimes find myself already knowing which hotels have rooms 11 and 12 adjacent. The way I can feel a particular cold through certain walls and doors. The way I've begun to avoid mirrors in the early morning hours, afraid of what might be standing behind me in the reflection, wearing my face but with eyes that have been awake far longer than they should have been. I called the Pineview Motor Lodge once, from a payphone in Nevada, just to confirm it was real. The same man answered, his voice unchanged. "Pineview," he said. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask what happened, to demand an explanation, but he continued before I could form words. "Room 12 is available if you're planning to come back through. Though I should mention 11 is occupied right now." A pause, and then quieter. "Has been since you left." I hung up. Haven't called back. Haven't gone back that direction at all, in fact, taking routes that add hours to any journey just to avoid that stretch of Interstate 70. But I think about it constantly, about that ledger with my name written twice, about the voice that knew exactly how I spoke, about the television that listened when I called out in the dark, about what the clerk meant when he said people show up twice. Because here's what keeps me awake in these anonymous hotel rooms, what has me checking and rechecking locks on doors that don't connect to anything. I remember checking into the Pineview Motor Lodge around 9 p.m., exhausted from driving, barely conscious of my surroundings. But I don't remember the hours before that. Don't remember what I was doing between 3 and 9. Don't remember where I stopped or why I was on that particular stretch of highway to begin with. There's a gap in my memory, 6 hours that should be there but aren't, and the only evidence they existed at all is my name in that ledger, written in my handwriting, checked into room 11 at 3:15 p.m. on a day I can't fully recall. Sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if I ever left that room, if I'm still there, on the other side of a connecting door, with the television playing static and my face pressed against the wall, listening to myself in room 12, waiting for myself to respond. And sometimes, when I'm drifting off in whatever bed I've paid for that night, I hear it. Faint, barely perceptible, like it's coming from very far away or through many layers of distance. The sound of a key turning in a lock, of a chain sliding free, of a door that was never supposed to open slowly swinging wide. The mark on my palm tingles then, and I wonder which side of the door I'm really on. Whether I'm the one who left or the one who stayed. Whether room 12 was ever mine at all, or if I've just been waiting in room 11 this entire time, patient and still, for myself to finally come back and complete whatever transaction began that night on Interstate 70. I keep driving, keep moving, because as long as I'm in motion, as long as I never stay anywhere long enough to establish a pattern, I can tell myself I'm the one who escaped, the one who got away, the one who exists on this side of reality, free and unmoored, and certain of my own continuity, but the mark never fully fades. and sometimes checking into a new hotel. I catch the desk clerk looking at me with recognition they shouldn't have, or I find my name already in their system, checked in hours before I arrived. And I know, with the terrible certainty of someone who has lived this loop before, that eventually I'll be too tired to keep running, that eventually I'll pull off the interstate at the wrong time, in the wrong state of exhaustion, and the only place with a vacancy will be somewhere with connecting doors and a ledger bound in green canvas, that someday, someone who looks like me will hand over a key and warn himself not to open the door, will lie in the darkness listening to his own voice echo back through the walls, will check out in confusion and find his name written twice, once in past tense, once in present, with the future still unfilled but waiting. And on that day, I'll finally understand which version of myself I've been all along, the one who listens, or the one who responds, the one who leaves, or the one who waits, the one in room 12, or the one who's been in room 11 since the beginning, patient and unchanging, existing in that gap between 3:15 and 9, between memory and forgetting, between the person I was and whoever I'm becoming. Until then, I keep the receipt from every hotel, checking them obsessively to confirm the dates and times match my memory. I keep driving, keep moving, keep running from a connection I've already made but haven't yet completed. And I never, ever respond when I hear static at 4:10 a.m. Because I know now what I didn't know then, that the voice on the other side of the wall isn't someone else. It's always been me. It's always been me. It always will be. Story 4. The lighthouse had been dead for 11 years when I accepted the caretaking position. 2 weeks. That's what the email said. Just enough time to catalog the remaining equipment before the Historical Society decided whether to gut the place or let it rot into the Atlantic. The pay was decent, the solitude appealing. I'd spent the last 6 months in a studio apartment in Portland, listening to neighbors argue through paper-thin walls, feeling the city press against my skull. The idea of sleeping to the sound of waves instead of traffic felt like medicine. The drive up the coast took longer than expected. November had stripped the trees bare, leaving skeletal branches that clawed at the gray sky. The access road to the lighthouse was more suggestion than path, overgrown with beach grass that scraped against my rental car's undercarriage. When I finally parked at the base of the keeper's cottage, the wind hit me like a physical thing, salt thick and relentless. The cottage itself was weathered shingle and peeling paint, hunched against the elements like something trying to make itself small. The lighthouse rose behind it, a white tower streaked with rust and bird droppings, its lamp housing dark and hollow. Someone had left a key under a rock by the door, along with a handwritten note about the generator and a warning about the water pressure. Inside, the cottage smelled of mildew and abandonment. Dust covered every surface in a uniform gray blanket. The furniture was minimal, a cot with a thin mattress, a wooden table, 2 chairs, a propane stove that hissed when I tested it. The bathroom worked, barely. The generator sat in a shed out back, a diesel beast that took 20 minutes and 3 different YouTube videos to coax into life. When it finally caught, the noise was monstrous, a mechanical roar that seemed to vibrate through my teeth. I spent the first day settling in, if you could call it that, made a grocery run to the nearest town, 15 miles south, unpacked my clothes, set up my laptop even though the internet was non-existent and cell service came and went like a fickle ghost. The work itself was straightforward. Photograph everything, note its condition, measure dimensions, check for structural damage. The Historical Society had sent me a 30-page checklist. The lighthouse interior was dim despite my flashlight. The walls were curved brick, sweating with moisture. The spiral staircase was cast iron, each step echoing as I climbed. 73 steps to the lamp room. I counted them twice. The lamp itself was a Fresnel lens, or what remained of one. Most of the glass prisms were intact but filthy, covered in decades of grime and bird droppings. The rotation mechanism was seized solid. The bulb housing was empty, the wiring long since stripped by salvagers or vandals. I took my photographs, made my notes. The lamp room had windows on all sides, providing a 360 view of the coast. To the east, the Atlantic stretched infinite and steel gray. To the west, the rocky shoreline curved away toward distant headlands. Below, waves broke white against barnacle-covered rocks. The wind up here was constant, finding gaps in the window frames, creating a low moan that never quite stopped. By the time I climbed back down, my legs were shaking from the descent. The spiral made me dizzy, the way it seemed to twist perception, making up feel like down and down feel like sideways. I emerged into the fading afternoon light, locked the lighthouse door behind me, and retreated to the cottage. That night, I heard it for the first time. The generator had quit around 8, and I decided not to restart it. The darkness out here was absolute, the kind that makes you understand why humans invented fire. I lay on the cot, listening to the waves, feeling sleep pull at me, when I saw the light. It swept across the cottage wall, a brief arc of pale illumination. Then again. A regular rhythm, maybe 4 seconds between each pass, the pattern of a lighthouse beam. I sat up, heart suddenly loud in my ears. Walked to the window. The lighthouse tower was dark, a black shape against a marginally less black sky. But as I watched, the light came again, emanating from the lamp room, sweeping across the water in a wide arc before continuing its rotation. I told myself there had to be an explanation. A boat, maybe. Someone messing around. But the light was coming from inside the lamp room. I was certain of it. And the Fresnel lens was broken, the bulb gone, the power dead. The light swept past again, and again, methodical, patient. I stood at that window for maybe 20 minutes, watching until the light finally stopped. The darkness returned, complete and pressing. I lay back down but didn't sleep for a long time, listening to my own breathing, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. The next morning, I climbed the lighthouse again, examined the lamp room in daylight. Nothing had changed. The lens was still filthy and motionless. There was no evidence anyone had been up here. The dust on the floor was undisturbed except for my own footprints from yesterday. I spent the day working, cataloging the keeper's cottage, photographing the outbuildings. But my attention kept drifting to the lighthouse, and when night came, I found myself watching from the cottage window again, waiting. The light began at 9:47 p.m. I know because I checked my phone when it started. The same sweeping pattern, originating from the lamp room, cutting across the water with clockwork precision. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, stood in the cold wind, and looked up at the tower. The light passed over me, through me, somehow both bright and insubstantial. It left no shadows. When I shone my flashlight at the lamp room windows, my beam passed through the arc of light without disturbing it. I should have left then, packed my car, and driven back to Portland, and let the Historical Society find someone else to catalog their haunted lighthouse. But there was something about the light, something almost peaceful in its regularity. It felt less like a threat and more like a message, a signal from something that didn't realize the world had moved on. The third night, I found the footprints. I'd been up in the lamp room trying to document the rotation mechanism when I noticed them on my way back down. Wet marks on the iron steps, not puddles exactly, more like the print a wet bare foot would leave. They started about halfway down the spiral and continued upward, toward the lamp room, toward where I'd just been standing. The prints were fresh. I could see the definition of toes, the shape of an arch. They glistened slightly in my flashlight beam. I followed them back up, my own footsteps careful, deliberate. The spiral seemed tighter now, the walls pressing closer. The footprints continued to the top landing, where the stairs ended at a blank brick wall. There used to be a door here, I remembered from the historical documents, access to a small observation deck that had been removed during a renovation in the 60s. Now there was just wall, and the wet footprints stopped right against it, as if whoever made them had walked through the brick and kept going. I stood there for a long time, flashlight trained on that blank wall, listening to my pulse in my ears and the wind howling outside. The wet marks were already beginning to dry, evaporating in the damp air. I reached out and touched the wall. Solid. Cold. Real. That night, the light seemed brighter, more insistent. I sat at the cottage table and watched it through the window, counting the seconds between each sweep. 4 seconds. Always 4 seconds. The precision of it made my skin crawl. There was intelligence behind this. Intention. This wasn't some natural phenomenon or trick of reflection. Something was operating that light. I'd brought a small radio with me, an old transistor model that got better reception than my phone. I turned it on, spun through stations until I found something that wasn't static. A talk show. Late-night conspiracy theories and call-in confessions. The host's voice was jovial, energetic in a way that felt obscene in this place. I left it on anyway, needing the reminder that the normal world still existed somewhere beyond this isolated spit of rock and water. Around midnight, the radio began to stutter. Not static, but something rhythmic. Clicks and pauses, long and short bursts. It took me a moment to recognize it as Morse code, or something close to it. I grabbed my phone, found an app that could translate, held it near the radio speaker. The letters appeared on screen one by one. I never arrived. My thumb hovered over the screen. I played it again, to be sure. The same message repeated, over and over. I never arrived. I never arrived. I never arrived. I turned off the radio. The silence that followed was suffocating. Outside, the light continued its patient rotation, and I became aware of a new sound beneath the wind and waves. A rhythmic tapping, like knuckles on wood. Soft but persistent, coming from the direction of the lighthouse. I should not have gone out there. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to lock the cottage door and wait for morning. But I found myself pulling on my jacket, grabbing my flashlight, stepping into the wind. The tapping grew louder as I approached the tower. Definitely knocking. 3 sharp raps, a pause, 3 more raps. Repeating. The lighthouse door was locked. I had the only key, but the knocking was coming from inside, echoing down the spiral staircase. I unlocked the door with shaking hands and stepped into the darkness of the tower. The sound stopped immediately. I stood in the sudden silence, flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The spiral stretched up into shadow. No movement. No sound except my own breathing and the eternal wind. I climbed. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if gravity was intensifying the higher I went. The walls seemed to pulse in my peripheral vision, breathing in rhythm with my footfalls. By the time I reached the lamp room, sweat was running down my back despite the cold. The Fresnel lens sat in its mounting, still and filthy, but someone had adjusted it. I was certain of this. The angle had changed. It was now pointed directly at the blank wall where the old door used to be, directly at where the wet footprints had ended. I approached slowly, examined the rotation mechanism. Still seized, still unmovable. Yet the lens had definitely been turned. Behind me I heard a soft splash, the sound of water dripping onto metal. I spun around. A small puddle had formed on the iron floor, seawater by the smell of it. As I watched, another drop fell from nowhere, landing with a clear plip. Then another. The puddle was growing, spreading across the floor in a perfect circle. The light from the lamp began to intensify, though there was no bulb, no power source. It grew brighter and brighter, casting the lamp room in stark white illumination that hurt my eyes. I raised my hand to shield my face and saw something in the water at my feet. A reflection, but not mine. A face staring up from the puddle, features distorted by the ripples, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. The face of someone drowning, looking up through fathoms of dark water, seeing light above but unable to reach it. I stumbled backward away from the puddle, and the light suddenly cut out. Darkness crashed back in, absolute and disorienting. My flashlight had gone dead. I fumbled for my phone, used its screen glow to find my way to the stairs. The descent was nightmare logic, the spiral seeming to go on forever, turning and turning. I kept expecting to see wet footprints ahead of me, climbing up to meet me. When I finally burst out the lighthouse door into the night air, my lungs were burning and my legs were trembling so badly I had to sit down right there on the rocks. The lighthouse stood silent behind me. No light, no tapping, just the wind and the waves and the overwhelming sense that something was watching from the lamp room window. I spent the rest of that night in the cottage with every light I could power burning. The generator roared outside, a mechanical guardian against whatever haunted the tower. I told myself I'd pack up in the morning, email the Historical Society, make up some excuse about a family emergency. But when dawn finally came, gray and hesitant, I found myself still sitting at the table, staring at my phone. The Morse code message replayed in my mind. I never arrived. I opened my laptop, what little battery it had left, and searched the spotty archives I'd downloaded before losing internet. Historical records of the lighthouse, keeper logs, incident reports. It took an hour of searching, but I found it. A notation from August 1968. A new keeper had been hired, a man transferring from a lighthouse down the coast. He'd called the day before his scheduled arrival to confirm the address. The log noted he was expected on the 12th, but there was no entry for the 12th. The next entry was dated the 14th, written by the assistant keeper, noting that the new man had never shown up. They'd found his car eventually, abandoned at a rest stop 60 miles south. No sign of him, no explanation. The lighthouse was automated 3 years later. The keeper's position was eliminated. I closed the laptop and looked out the window at the tower. The morning light made it seem almost mundane, just old brick and peeling paint. But I could feel it now, a presence pressing against my awareness. Someone who had meant to arrive here, who had been traveling toward this place, who had perhaps gotten close enough to see it across the water. And then what? Disappeared? Died? Gotten lost in some fold between intending to arrive and actually arriving? The light wasn't a warning. It was a vigil. I stayed for the remaining 9 days of my contract. I documented everything methodically, professionally. Each night I watched the light sweep across the water, regular as a heartbeat. Each night I heard the knocking, soft and persistent. Sometimes I found wet footprints on the stairs. Sometimes the puddle would reappear in the lamp room, showing me that drowning face staring up from impossible depths. On my last night, I did something I'd been considering for days. I climbed to the lamp room just before sunset, positioned my own flashlight where it could shine through the Fresnel lens, what remained of it, and turned it on. The filthy prisms caught the beam and scattered it, weak and fractured, but visible. I aimed it at the blank wall, at the place where a door used to be, where the wet footprints always ended. Then I turned off my flashlight. The knocking stopped. The tower fell completely silent. Outside, the sea grew calm, the waves diminishing to gentle swells that barely whispered against the rocks. The wind died. Even the generator's roar seemed to soften. In that stillness, I heard something new, not from the lighthouse, but from the direction of the keeper's cottage. The sound of a car door closing. Footsteps on gravel. The creak of the cottage door opening. I descended the spiral stairs quickly, emerged into the twilight. The cottage door stood open. Inside, I could see a shape moving, but the angle was wrong, the proportions off, like watching someone through water. I walked to the doorway and looked in. The cottage was empty. My belongings were still scattered on the table. My coat still hung on its hook. But something felt different, lighter, like a pressure had been released. On the table, next to my laptop, was a set of keys, not my rental car keys. These were older, iron and rust-spotted, a lighthouse keeper's keys. I left them there, packed my car in the dark, drove away without looking back at the tower. But sometimes when I'm falling asleep in my Portland apartment, I hear it, the rhythm of that knocking. 3 raps, a pause, 3 more raps. And I wonder if turning off my light was the right thing to do, or if I condemned someone to keep waiting, to keep almost arriving but never quite making it through the door. I wonder if I left that place at all, or if some part of me is still climbing those 73 steps, approaching a blank wall, leaving wet footprints that dry before anyone can see them. The Historical Society sent me a check. The lighthouse was demolished 6 months later, something about structural instability and insurance liability. They sent me photos of the site afterward, just a concrete foundation and some scattered bricks. The keeper's cottage was gone too, but I still have the keys. I keep them in my desk drawer, iron and rust spotted, and sometimes I take them out and feel their weight and wonder what door they open, and whether that door exists in the world I'm living in now, or somewhere else entirely. On foggy nights, I think I can hear the generator running, and I remember the face in the puddle, staring up through fathoms of nothing, seeing light above, but never ever reaching it. I never went back to check if the keys were real or if I imagined them. Some questions, I've learned, are safer left unanswered. Story 5. The real estate agent's smile had been too wide when she handed me the keys. I should have noticed that. Should have noticed how quickly she left, how her heels clicked against the porch steps in perfect rhythm, like she was counting down to something. But I was too busy calculating profit margins, imagining the before and after photos that would make my renovation business the talk of Charleston, a Victorian in Savannah's historic district for 30% below market value. The math was simple. The decision was obvious. I moved in on a Tuesday in late September when the Spanish moss hung so still in the live oaks that the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. The house exhaled at 1:19 a.m. I woke to sweetness, not the cloying artificial sweetness of air freshener or the chemical tang of cleaning products left by the previous owners. This was warm, inviting, the smell of something just pulled from an oven. Butter and vanilla and caramelized sugar. My stomach growled despite the late hour, despite the strangeness of waking to such a scent in an empty house where I hadn't yet unpacked my kitchen boxes. The smell was strongest near the ceiling of my second-floor bedroom, drifting down like invisible smoke. I stood on the bed in my boxer shorts, following the scent upward, pressing my face against the plaster until I found the attic access panel I hadn't bothered to investigate during the walkthrough. The ladder groaned as I pulled it down. Dust motes swirled in the beam of my phone's flashlight, and I climbed into a space that smelled like a bakery at dawn. The attic was smaller than I expected, the peaked roof forcing me to hunch as I moved across boards that creaked warnings with every step. Cardboard boxes lined one wall, their sides soft with age and moisture. A dress form stood in the corner like a headless sentinel, and there, in the center of the floor, perfectly centered beneath the highest point of the roof, sat an antique plate. White porcelain with a delicate blue pattern around the rim. On its surface, arranged in a perfect circle, was powdered sugar. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my phone's light casting harsh shadows across the floorboards, trying to construct a rational explanation. Maybe the previous owners had left it. Maybe I was still dreaming. Maybe the sugar had been there for years, preserved somehow in the dry attic air. I picked up the plate. The sugar remained in its perfect circle, undisturbed by my movements. When I tilted it, the powder clung to the porcelain, as if it had been lacquered there. Downstairs, I scrubbed the plate in my bathroom sink, watching white clouds dissolve in the water. I dried it carefully, stacked it with my few other dishes in the kitchen, and went back to bed. But I couldn't sleep. The smell lingered in my nostrils, sweet and persistent, and beneath it I began to detect something else. Something that reminded me of old houses I'd renovated before. The scent of time itself, of decades compressed into walls and floors, of lives lived and ended and forgotten. When my alarm went off at 6, I was already awake. The attic ladder hung down into the hallway. I knew I had pushed it back up. I was certain of it. But there it was, extended fully, each metal rung catching the morning light that filtered through the hallway window. I climbed up anyway. What else could I do? The plate was back in the center of the floor. The powdered sugar had returned. But now it wasn't just a circle. Now it was 2 circles, side by side, with small depressions in the center of each, like the seats of chairs. and between them, a space. An absence that suggested a third. I didn't touch it this time. I took photos with my phone, the flash turning the sugar into something that glowed white and otherworldly. Then I left the plate where it was and spent the day ripping out the rotted sections of the back porch, telling myself that old houses settle in strange ways. That maybe there was an animal in the attic redistributing the sugar I'd missed, that I was overtired and seeing patterns where none existed. The hardware store clerk recognized me from my previous projects in the area. He asked how the renovation was going, and I found myself describing the house without mentioning the attic, without mentioning the smell or the sugar, or the feeling that had begun to settle in my chest like sediment at the bottom of a glass. That night I stayed downstairs until midnight, sanding the dining room floor until my arms ached and my lungs burned with dust. When I finally climbed the stairs to my bedroom, I paused at the attic access, listening. Nothing. Just the usual sounds of an old house. Settling boards, wind in the eaves, the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I brushed my teeth, set my alarm, and lay in bed watching the ceiling, waiting. At 1:19 a.m., the smell returned. Stronger this time. So strong that I could almost taste it, could feel the ghost of granulated sugar dissolving on my tongue. I threw off my sheets and pulled down the attic ladder without hesitation, taking the steps 2 at a time. The plate was there. The sugar was there. But now the pattern had changed. 2 chair shapes, yes, but now they faced each other across a small table. The detail was remarkable. I could see the individual legs, the crossbars between them, even what looked like the curved backs. And in the space where the third chair should be, the sugar had been swept away entirely, leaving clean floorboards that looked freshly polished. I knelt beside the plate, my knees cracking against the wood, and leaned close enough to see that the sugar wasn't just arranged. It was compressed, packed down like snow under footsteps, creating depth and shadow in the white powder. Someone was coming up here while I slept. Had to be. Maybe entering through an exterior access I hadn't found yet. Maybe a previous owner who still had keys. Maybe a squatter who'd been living in the house before I bought it and refused to leave. I searched the attic thoroughly, running my hands along every wall, checking every corner for hidden doors or loose boards. I found nothing except decades of dust and the growing certainty that I was being played with. The next day I changed all the locks. I installed motion sensor lights outside. I even called the real estate agent, but her number went straight to a voicemail that sounded like it hadn't been checked in months. The hardware store clerk mentioned, when I was buying the new deadbolts, that the house had sold 4 times in 6 years. He said it with the careful neutrality of someone who knows more than he's willing to share, and I didn't press him. Didn't want to hear whatever story he'd tell. Didn't want to give whatever was happening any more power than it already had. But that night, I carried a folding chair up to the attic. I don't know why. Or maybe I do, and I just don't want to admit it. Maybe I wanted to see what would happen if I participated instead of resisted. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was already losing the battle to think rationally about any of this. I placed the chair in the empty space where the sugar had been swept away. It fit perfectly, as if the gap had been measured for it. Then I went downstairs, locked my bedroom door from the inside, and wedged the door shut with my dresser. Sleep came eventually, restless and shallow, my dreams full of the sound of chairs scraping across wooden floors. The smell woke me at 1:19 a.m. Vanilla and butter and something else now, something underneath the sweetness. Like the smell of old paper, or maybe mothballs, or maybe just the accumulated scent of years pressing down from above. I couldn't move the dresser quietly, so I shoved it aside in one harsh scrape that probably woke whatever neighbors existed beyond these thick walls. The bedroom door swung open, the attic ladder was down, and from above, I heard it. A creak, long and slow and deliberate, the sound of weight shifting on old floorboards, the sound of someone settling into a chair. I stood at the base of the ladder, one hand on the frame, my heart doing complicated things in my chest that probably weren't medically sound. Every rational impulse told me to go back to my room, to call the police, to leave this house and never come back. But I climbed. The plate was still in the center of the floor. The sugar pattern had expanded. Now it showed 3 chairs around a table, each one detailed enough that I could count the spindles in the backs. On the table's surface, rendered in careful lines of compressed powder, were what looked like teacups and saucers. My chair hadn't moved from where I'd placed it, but when I looked at it now, I saw that it was positioned differently, pulled in closer to where the sugar table would be, angled slightly, as if someone had just stood up from it. The attic air was thick and sweet and absolutely still. I sat down in the chair. I don't know what I expected. Lightning. A voice. Something to reach out from the darkness and confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. But there was nothing except the smell and the silence and the feeling of the old wood beneath me. Warm as if someone else had just been sitting there. I stayed for 10 minutes. 20. An hour. The sugar pattern didn't change. The smell didn't fade. And slowly, so slowly, I almost didn't notice it at first, the attic began to feel smaller. Not physically, but the darkness seemed to press closer. The space between me and the walls seemed to compress, and I became aware of how loud my breathing was in that silence. When I finally stood to leave, the chair scraped against the floor, and from somewhere in the attic, somewhere I couldn't see in the darkness beyond my phone's light, I heard an answering scrape. Chair legs against wood. The sound of something or someone adjusting their position. I didn't run down the ladder. Running would have been an admission of fear, and I wasn't ready for that yet. But I moved quickly, pushing the ladder up behind me, and this time, I didn't just wedge my dresser against the bedroom door. I dragged it into the hallway and positioned it directly under the attic access panel. The smell followed me anyway. It seeped through the cracks, filled my bedroom, clung to my sheets. I slept with all the lights on and woke at dawn with the taste of sugar in my mouth. The next day, I worked downstairs exclusively, avoiding the second floor entirely. I told myself I was being strategic, tackling the kitchen renovation while I planned my approach to the upper level. But I was really just avoiding the inevitable trip back to the attic. The hardware store clerk was more talkative that afternoon. He mentioned, while I was selecting paint samples, that the previous owner had left suddenly, packed up in the middle of the night and moved out of state. Before him, the owner before that had sold after only 3 months, and before that, there was a couple who'd lasted almost a year before the wife had refused to stay another night. I asked what happened to make her leave. He just shrugged and said that old houses have their quirks, and some people aren't suited to the maintenance they require. That night, I didn't go to bed. I sat in the living room with every light on, watching renovation videos on my laptop until the battery died and my eyes felt full of sand. At 1:19 a.m., I heard the smell rather than smelled it, if that makes any sense. It announced itself with a pressure in my sinuses, a thickness in the air that made breathing feel like work. The attic was directly above me. I stared at the ceiling, watching for cracks, for movement, for any sign of what was happening up there. The house creaked. Once, then again, then a third time, each creak in a different location, as if something was walking from one end of the attic to the other. Then the scraping started. Long, slow drags of wood against wood. The sound of furniture being moved. And beneath it, quieter but somehow more disturbing, the whisper of something being swept across the floor. The sugar, I realized. The pattern was being rearranged while I sat downstairs like a coward, listening. It went on for an hour. The moving, the scraping, the soft whisper of powder against boards. I recorded it on my phone, thinking I could show someone, prove that I wasn't imagining this. But when I played it back, the recording was silent except for my own breathing. When the sounds finally stopped, I waited another hour before I moved. The house had gone quiet in a way that felt expectant, like it was holding its breath again, waiting to see what I would do. I climbed to the second floor. The dresser was still under the attic access, undisturbed, but the ladder had pushed through it somehow, the metal frame phasing through the wooden furniture as if solid objects were just suggestions in this house. The attic smelled like a bakery at the height of morning rush. The air was so saturated with sweetness that I could feel it coating my throat, making me swallow reflexively. The plate was gone. In its place, drawn directly on the floorboards in what must have been pounds of powdered sugar, was a complete room. Not just chairs and a table now, but walls, a doorway, a window with curtains. The detail was extraordinary. I could see the grain of the wood rendered in parallel lines of sugar, could see the individual panes in the window, could see, in the center of the room, 3 chairs arranged around a table set for tea. 2 of the chairs faced each other. The third, the chair I had brought up, faced out, toward me. And in that chair, pressed into the sugar like a fossil in stone, was the impression of a body. Shoulders, back, head. Someone had been sitting there, was sitting there, could still be sitting there in some way I couldn't perceive. I stood at the edge of the sugar drawing, afraid to step on it, afraid to disturb whatever ritual or invitation or warning this represented. The folding chair I'd brought up was pushed in close to the table now, the metal legs leaving marks in the powder where someone had dragged it forward. The smell was overwhelming. I could barely breathe. My vision started to blur at the edges, and I realized I was either hyperventilating or the air in the attic was somehow thinner than it should be. I backed toward the ladder, keeping my eyes on the sugar room, half expecting it to change while I watched. But it remained frozen. A perfect snapshot of a space that shouldn't exist, rendered in powder that should have scattered in the drafts that surely moved through this old attic. Downstairs, I locked myself in the bathroom and ran cold water over my face until my hands stopped shaking. In the mirror, my eyes looked wrong. Too wide, too bright. The eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in days and was starting to fray at the edges. The real estate agent finally called me back the next morning. I was standing in the kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted like vanilla and butter no matter how much I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Her voice on the phone was cheerful, professional, and absolutely unhelpful. She remembered the house, of course. Lovely property, good bones. The previous owners had left some items in the attic, she believed. Sometimes estate sales didn't clear everything out. Had I found anything interesting? I asked her about the turnover rate. 4 sales in 6 years. There was a pause. Then she said that some houses just took time to find the right owner. That historic properties could be challenging. That it was important to respect the character of the place, to understand that when you bought a house with history, you were agreeing to maintain not just the structure, but the stories it held. I asked what stories the house held. She said she wasn't at liberty to discuss previous owners' experiences, but that she could send me some historical documents if I was interested in the property's background. Then she mentioned, with that same careful neutrality the hardware store clerk had used, that the house tended to sell quickly if the renovations were kept to the first floor. I hung up and stared at my coffee, watching steam rise from the surface in spirals that reminded me too much of the way sugar had looked scattered across the attic floor. That afternoon, I didn't work on the house. I sat on the front porch with my laptop, researching. The house had been built in 1887 by a merchant who'd made his fortune in the cotton trade. He'd died in 1912, and the house had passed through various hands over the decades. Nothing remarkable. No murders, no tragedies. Nothing that would explain what was happening in the attic. But there was one detail that caught my attention. In 1934, the house had been divided into apartments. The attic had been converted into living space, a small apartment that rented cheaply to women who worked in the nearby shops and restaurants. And in 1936, 2 women who'd been living there had disappeared. Not died, not moved away, just stopped showing up to work one day. And when the landlord finally checked their apartment, he found it empty except for furniture and the smell of baking bread. The case had never been solved. The women were never found. And after that, the attic had been closed off, sealed until someone reunited the house in the 1970s. I closed my laptop and watched the Spanish moss sway in the late afternoon breeze, moving in ways that seemed deliberate, purposeful, like fingers beckoning. That night, I moved my mattress downstairs to the living room. I told myself it was temporary, just until I could figure out what to do. But I knew I was avoiding the second floor the way you avoid looking at an injury you're not ready to acknowledge. At 1:19 a.m., the smell came anyway. It moved through the house like a living thing, seeping through vents, curling around doorways, filling every room with sweetness so intense it almost burned. I lay on my mattress and listened to the sounds from above. The scraping, the creaking, the whisper of sugar being arranged into patterns I couldn't see but could feel somehow, pressing down through the ceiling. And then, new sounds. Footsteps, light and quick, moving from the attic down to the second floor, down the stairs to the first floor, coming closer. I sat up, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The footsteps stopped in the hallway, just outside the living room doorway. I could hear breathing that wasn't my own, soft and steady and absolutely real. The smell intensified, the air grew thick, and in the doorway where nothing visible stood, I felt the weight of attention, of being observed, of something waiting to see what I would do. I didn't move, couldn't move. We stayed like that for minutes that stretched into something that felt like hours. Me on my mattress, and the presence in the doorway and the house breathing around us both. Then, from the second floor, another scrape. Longer this time, the sound of my folding chair being dragged across the attic floor. The presence in the doorway shifted, turned, moved back toward the stairs with those same light, quick footsteps, and I knew with absolute certainty that it was going back up to the attic, back to the sugar room, back to the third chair that I had provided. In the morning, I found the hardware store clerk's business card in my wallet. He answered on the second ring, and when I asked him what I was supposed to do about the house, he was quiet for so long I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he said that the house had its patterns, its requirements, that previous owners had tried removing the plate, had tried blocking the attic, had tried clearing out everything and starting fresh, but the house always brought them back, always insisted. I asked what I was supposed to do. He said that most people left, sold quickly, took a loss, moved on. But one owner, years ago, had stayed, had accepted the invitation, had spent a year living in that house before she finally left, and when she did, she'd told him that she'd never felt less alone in her entire life. I asked if that was supposed to comfort me. He said that wasn't the point. The point was choice. The house was offering something. Whether I took it or walked away was up to me. That night I stood at the base of the attic ladder for an hour before I climbed. The sugar room had grown. It filled half the attic now, the walls extending almost to the edges of the real space. The window showed a view of trees that didn't exist outside. The doorway opened onto darkness that felt deeper than the attic shadows. And at the table, pulled in close, the 3 chairs waited. The plate had returned to the center of the table, and on it were 3 perfect cookies. Round and golden, still steaming as if they'd just come from an oven that couldn't possibly exist in this space. I sat in my chair. The metal was warm. The sugar room drew closer around me, its walls becoming more solid with every breath I took. The smell was everywhere, inside me and outside me, and I couldn't tell anymore where the sweetness ended and my own breath began. Across from me, the other chairs remained empty in a way that suggested they wouldn't be empty for long, that they were patient, that they'd been waiting much longer than I'd been alive, and they could wait much longer still. I reached for one of the cookies. My hand passed through it, through the plate, through the sugar table itself. Not real then, or real in a way I couldn't yet perceive. Real in a way I might never fully understand. But the smell was real, the warmth of the chair was real, and the feeling of being welcomed, of being expected, of taking my place in a pattern that had been waiting decades to complete itself, that was real too. I sit here now, in my folding chair at the sugar table, and I don't know how long I've been here. The attic seems brighter than it should be, the darkness held back by a light that doesn't come from any visible source. Sometimes I think I see movement in the other chairs, shadows that might be shoulders, outlines that might be hands reaching for cookies I still can't touch. The real estate agent was right. The house does sell quickly if you stop moving the chairs, but I haven't moved them. I've joined them. And every night at 1:19 a.m., I climb to the attic and take my place at a table set for 3, breathing in sweetness, waiting to see if the other chairs will finally become occupied in ways I can see, or if I'll remain here forever, the third guest at a tea party that never quite begins. The hardware store clerk calls sometimes. I let it go to voicemail. He leaves messages asking how the renovation is going, if I've made progress on the house, if I'm planning to sell soon. I don't call back, because I'd have to tell him that I've stopped working on the first floor, that I've moved my mattress to the second floor hallway, as close to the attic access as I can get, that the smell of vanilla and butter is the first thing I notice when I wake, and the last thing I notice before I sleep, and that I've stopped questioning whether it's real, that I've started looking forward to 1:19 a.m. the way I used to look forward to morning coffee, that I've begun to understand the pattern, to feel the rhythm of it, to recognize my place in something larger than my renovation plans or profit margins or any of the reasons I thought I'd bought this house. The chairs are waiting. They've always been waiting. And now, finally, so am I. The house breathes. I breathe with it. And somewhere in the sugar room that grows larger every night, 3 chairs sit at a table that's almost ready to be used, by people or presences or something else entirely, something I'm only beginning to understand I'm becoming part of. Tomorrow I'll go to the hardware store for more supplies. I'll smile at the clerk and tell him the renovation is going well. I'll buy whatever I need to maintain the house, to keep it in good condition, to respect its requirements. And tomorrow night, at 1:19 a.m., I'll climb to the attic one more time. I'll sit in my chair at the sugar table, and I'll wait, with the patience of old houses and older invitations, to see who or what finally takes their place in the chairs beside me. Because some patterns aren't meant to be broken, some invitations aren't meant to be refused, and some houses don't need renovation at all. They just need the right occupant to understand what they've been trying to say all along. The 3rd chair is taken now. The pattern is nearly complete. And in the sweetness that fills every corner of this house, I'm learning to accept that I may not be the renovator here at all. I may just be the final piece of furniture, carefully positioned, patiently waiting to be used. Story 6. The desert doesn't care if you're watching it. That's what I kept telling myself as I drove the dirt road into the Jornada del Muerto, 3 hours north of Las Cruces. The landscape stretched flat and hostile in every direction, interrupted only by the occasional mesquite skeleton and distant mountains that looked painted onto the horizon. I'd chosen this spot specifically for its emptiness, its distance from the light pollution that ruined every other attempt at capturing the Milky Way's full glory. My phone had shown 0 bars since I'd left the highway. I set up camp 2 hours before sunset, giving myself time to scout shooting locations and test exposures. The tent went up easily in the windless air. My camera equipment filled the backseat of my truck, organized with the precision of someone who'd learned the hard way. What happened when you couldn't find a lens cap in the dark? The tripod legs sank slightly into the sand as I positioned them, and I made mental notes about where to anchor things once full night arrived. The temperature began its desert plummet as the sun touched the western peaks. I'd brought layers, but standing still behind a camera for hours would test even my preparation. I heated a can of soup on my portable stove, eating mechanically while watching the sky transition through its evening performance. Orange to pink to deep purple to that electric blue that only lasts for minutes. Then my phone rang. The sound jolted through the silence like an alarm. I pulled it from my jacket pocket, squinting at the screen in confusion. 1 bar flickered there, weak and intermittent. The incoming number made my breath catch. It was nearly identical to mine, every digit matching except 1. Where mine ended in 7, this one ended in 3. I answered, bringing the phone to my ear. Wind, just wind, howling with a hollow quality that suggested distance or depth. No voice, no background noise that would indicate a person on the other end. Just that steady rush of air moving through something, past something. I was about to hang up when I heard it underneath the wind. A mechanical click, sharp and familiar. It was the sound of my camera's shutter. I looked at my DSLR sitting on the tripod 15 feet away. Silent, untouched. I raised the phone again, but the line had gone dead. The single bar of signal vanished as I watched. My hands felt cold as I checked the phone's log. The call duration showed 4 seconds. The number stared back at me from the recent calls list. Definitely not mine, but disturbingly close. A wrong number, obviously. Someone nearby with a similar plan, perhaps another photographer. The shutter sound was coincidence, or my imagination filling in the gaps of white noise. I returned to my camera and began shooting test frames as the stars emerged. The first few exposures came back perfect, the sensor drinking in light from stars that had been traveling for centuries. I adjusted settings, changing ISOs and exposure times, falling into the familiar rhythm of the work. Photography had always been meditation for me, a way to shut out everything except light and composition. The phone rang again at 9:47 p.m. Same number. Same single bar of impossible signal. I answered it this time with my camera in hand, watching the display as I brought the phone to my ear. Wind again, but different now. Less hollow, more present, and then the click, that unmistakable sound of my shutter releasing. This time I was ready. I pulled the phone away and looked at my camera. The display showed the image count had increased by 1. I hadn't touched the shutter button. My pulse hammered in my temples as I reviewed the camera's screen. The newest image showed my campsite from an angle I hadn't used, positioned perhaps 20 yards to the east. The tent sat in the frame's center, and there in the foreground, clearly visible in the long exposure, were footprints in the sand. They circled the tent in a wide arc, the prints deep and distinct. I spun around, scanning the desert with my headlamp. Nothing. No movement. No sound except my own breathing. I walked to where the photo suggested the prints should be, sweeping my light across the ground. The sand showed only my own tracks from setting up camp. I checked my boots. Clean. No fresh dust. No disturbed sand clinging to the treads. The logical part of my brain tried to assert itself. Maybe I'd walked that pattern earlier and forgotten. Maybe the long exposure had captured old prints from previous visitors. But I'd watched this ground carefully when I arrived. I'd checked for snake holes, for ant colonies, for anything that might disturb my gear. There had been nothing. I looked at my phone. No signal again. The call didn't appear in the recent list this time. Sleep seemed impossible, but I tried anyway. Lying in my sleeping bag with the headlamp on, the phone clutched in one hand. Every sound made me flinch. The tent fabric rustling. The distant cry of something that might have been a coyote. My own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Somewhere past midnight, I forced myself to think rationally. I was alone, exhausted from the drive, probably dehydrated despite drinking water throughout the day. The human mind created patterns from nothing. It filled in gaps with fears. I'd read enough about isolation psychology to know that spending time alone in extreme environments could produce perceptual distortions. I got up and walked outside, needing to reclaim some sense of control. The stars were magnificent, the Milky Way a river of light splitting the sky. This was why I'd come here, this moment of connection with something vast and indifferent. I picked up 5 small rocks and arranged them in a line at the tent's entrance, a simple marker to prove to my morning self that I was thinking clearly. Back inside, I set an alarm for an hour before dawn. The best light would come then, that brief window when the sky held both stars and the first hint of sunrise. I needed to be ready. The alarm never had a chance to sound. I woke to the phone ringing, the screen's glow harsh in the tense darkness. 3:33 a.m. The same number, but this time 2 bars showed. My hand shook as I answered. The wind was closer now, so close I could almost feel it against my face. Could almost smell the desert sage and dust it carried. And underneath it, something else. Breathing, maybe. Or the sound of someone moving through sand. The shutter click came again, but this time it was followed by another, and another. Click, click, click. 3 shots in rapid succession. I ended the call and scrambled out of the tent. The rocks I'd arranged were gone. In their place stood a small tower, maybe 8 inches tall. The stones had been stacked with careful precision, balanced in a way that suggested deliberate effort. I knew immediately what it resembled. A cell tower, a signal repeater, the kind of structure that carries transmissions across empty spaces. My camera sat on its tripod exactly where I'd left it. The image count showed 3 new photos. I didn't want to look. My fingers trembled as I navigated the menu. As I pulled up the review screen, the first image showed my tent from the south, another angle I hadn't shot. The second showed it from the west. The third showed it from directly above, as if the camera had been suspended in the air 20 feet up. In all 3 images, I could see footprints. They formed a perfect circle around the tent now, the prints deep and evenly spaced. And in the overhead shot, at the tent's entrance where my rock tower stood, I could see a figure. Dark, blurred by motion, but definitely human-shaped. It stood over the rocks, appearing to place the final stone. I zoomed in on the figure's feet. The boots looked exactly like mine. The sky was beginning its pre-dawn shift, that subtle change in darkness that comes before any hint of color. I should have been preparing my equipment, should have been checking settings and planning shots. Instead, I stood frozen, staring at impossible photographs taken by a camera that hadn't moved. The phone rang again. Same number. 3 bars now. I didn't want to answer, but my thumb moved on its own, accepting the call. This time there was no wind. The silence on the other end felt thick, present. Then I heard it. My own voice, distorted slightly by distance or interference, saying words I hadn't spoken yet. "I'm still here." The line went dead. I examined the ground around the tent with my headlamp and the growing dawn light. No footprints. Nothing but my own tracks and the disturbed sand where I'd paced in confusion. I walked out 50 yards in every direction, searching for any sign that someone else had been here. The desert remained unmarked except by my presence. The rock tower stood stable despite the increasing wind. I knelt beside it, studying the construction. The stones fit together with a precision that would have taken me several attempts to achieve. They showed no obvious signs of having been moved, no disturbed sand around their base. They simply existed, impossible and solid. I picked up my camera, intending to document this, to have proof of something concrete. But when I raised it to my eye, the viewfinder showed something that made my stomach drop. The rock tower was gone. The space where it stood appeared empty through the lens. I lowered the camera and looked with my naked eyes. The tower remained. Raised the camera again. Empty ground. The growing light painted the landscape in shades of gray and amber. Under normal circumstances, this would be prime shooting time. The quality of light that photographers chase across continents. But my hands wouldn't stop shaking, and the viewfinder kept showing me a world that didn't match what I could see. I forced myself to pack up the camera equipment, moving through the familiar motions like a ritual that might restore normalcy. Each lens went into its padded case. Each battery into its designated pocket. The tripod collapsed with smooth mechanical precision. Everything was accounted for, everything in its place, except my phone showed 17 new photos in its gallery. Photos I hadn't taken. All of them showed my campsite from impossible angles. From underground, looking up through transparent sand. From inside the tent, looking out through fabric that appeared translucent. From positions that would require hovering, or flying, or existing in multiple places simultaneously. In several of them, I could see myself. Not as I was now, but as I would be moments later. Packing up equipment, standing with my hand on the tent, looking at my phone with an expression of dawning horror. I deleted them all. Then I checked the trash folder and deleted them again. The phone showed 0 photos in storage. I set it down carefully on the truck's hood and stepped back. It rang immediately. 4 bars. Full signal in a place that should have none. The same number, my number with 1 digit wrong. 1 digit that made all the difference between reaching me and reaching something else. I didn't answer. The ringing continued for exactly 17 seconds. Then it stopped, and a text message arrived. Check the camera. The DSLR sat in its bag in the truck's back seat. I hadn't turned it on since packing it away. I pulled it out anyway, powered it up, navigated to the image review. 1 new photo, time-stamped 3 minutes in the future. It showed me from behind, standing exactly where I stood now, looking at a camera that showed an image of me looking at a camera that showed an image of me looking at a camera that showed. The recursion hurt to follow. Each nested image grew darker, the figure in the frame becoming less distinct. But in the deepest iteration I could make out, at the center of the infinite regression, something else stood behind me. Something with my shape but wrong proportions. Something that cast a shadow in the opposite direction from the sun. I closed the camera and put it back in the bag. My movements felt mechanical, disconnected. The tent came down with practiced efficiency. The stakes pulled from the sand. The rock tower remained untouched. I couldn't bring myself to dismantle it. Couldn't make my hands reach out to disturb those carefully balanced stones. The drive back to the highway took 40 minutes. My phone showed 0 bars until I was within sight of the pavement. Then it jumped immediately to 4 bars, and the voicemail notification appeared. 7 new messages, all from my own number. The one with a 3 instead of a 7. I deleted them without listening. Then I turned off the phone completely, removed the SIM card, and put both pieces in separate compartments of my camera bag. The desert stretched behind me in the rearview mirror, empty and vast and completely indifferent to what had happened, to what might still be happening, to whatever remained at that campsite, making calls to a phone that shouldn't have signal, taking photos with a camera that hadn't left its bag. 3 days later, I developed the memory card from my DSLR. Among the legitimate photos of stars and landscapes, I found 17 images I didn't remember seeing before. Each one showed a progression. The rock tower growing taller, the footprints multiplying, the circled pattern becoming a spiral, then a maze, then something with geometry that hurt to follow. The final image was dated tomorrow. It shows my apartment, my desk where I'm writing this, the window behind me where the afternoon light comes through, and there, reflected in the glass, is the same dark figure from the desert photos. It stands behind my right shoulder, one hand raised as if about to place something on my head. A crown of small stones, balanced with impossible precision. My phone is still off, still separated from its SIM card. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it ringing in the bag where I've stored it. The sound is muffled but distinct, and if I'm very quiet, very still, I can hear something else underneath it. The click of a camera shutter. Always 3 seconds before I think about taking a photo. Always recording something I haven't done yet. The rock tower is growing on my desk now. I don't remember starting it. But each morning there's one more stone, balanced with perfect precision. Yesterday it was 4 inches tall. Today it's 6. The stones show no fingerprints. The balance seems to defy physics. Tomorrow, according to that final photo, it will be tall enough to touch my head, and I'll be standing exactly where I am now, looking at a screen that shows this moment, nested within this moment, nested within this moment, repeating down into darkness where something with my face looks back from every iteration. The phone is ringing again. I'm going to answer it this time. I'm going to find out what I have to say to myself, what I've been trying to warn about. The tower is almost complete. Story 7. When the fluorescent lights always knew I was coming. That's how I started thinking about it after the 3rd week cleaning the basement levels of Hartwell University. The motion sensors would trigger in sequence down the corridor, one section at a time, painting rectangles of buzzing white light across scuffed linoleum that hadn't been replaced since the building went up in 1962. But they'd activate one corridor ahead of where I stood, as if anticipating my route, or as if someone invisible walked just beyond my sight line, opening a path for me to follow. I'd been doing overnight maintenance for 6 months. The pay was decent, the work was solitary, and nobody asked questions about the gap in my employment history. The upper floors were standard institutional spaces, lecture halls that smelled like dry erase markers, labs with that particular chemical tang, offices crammed with books and cold coffee. But the basement was different. 3 sub-levels that housed the university's mechanical systems, storage, and forgotten archive rooms that probably hadn't been opened since the Carter administration. The building superintendent, a man whose face seemed constructed entirely from weathered leather and disappointment, had given me the basics during orientation. Keep the corridors clean. Check for leaks. Don't touch the mechanical rooms. Don't enter any locked spaces. Don't stay past 6 in the morning. He'd handed me a walkie-talkie tuned to the maintenance frequency and told me to check in every hour. That walkie-talkie became the second strange thing I noticed. It was a Tuesday, sometime after 2 in the morning, when I first heard it. I'd just finished mopping the B2 corridor, working my way east to west like always, when static crackled from the radio clip to my belt. Then my own voice came through, distorted slightly by the transmission, reporting my location and status. I froze, one hand still gripping the mop handle, and stared at the device. I hadn't pressed the talk button. The voice continued with my scheduled route, describing areas I hadn't reached yet with an accuracy that made my scalp prickle. I grabbed the radio and held it close, watching the indicator light. It wasn't transmitting, but the voice kept going. My voice, finishing the check-in I would have made, describing conditions I hadn't yet observed but would find exactly as described when I got there 20 minutes later. I told myself it was a recording malfunction, some kind of feedback loop in the old system. The building's wiring was a mess of upgrades and patches spanning 6 decades. Cross signals happened, technical glitches, nothing supernatural about radio waves getting confused in a concrete labyrinth. But the timing was always exactly 1 minute ahead of where I actually was. I started testing it. I'd stop randomly, break my usual pattern, take unexpected turns into storage annexes. The lights ahead kept moving. The radio kept broadcasting my route, 1 minute forward, as if I'd continued on schedule. When I finally caught up to where I was supposed to be, everything matched. The wet floor I'd theoretically mopped, the trash bins I'd theoretically emptied, even though I was seeing them for the first time. The door appeared on a Thursday. I was working B3, the deepest level, where the ceiling pipes were so low I had to duck every few feet and the air tasted like rust and old paper. The lights flickered in their usual sequence, pulling me down a corridor I'd walked 100 times. But this time, between the janitor's closet and the boiler room access, there was a door. Heavy gauge metal, institutional gray, no window, no number, no marking of any kind. Just a door that shouldn't exist in a wall I could have sworn was solid the night before. Rusty water seeped from beneath it, a thin line of rust-colored liquid that spread across the floor in a slow-growing stain. I crouched down, careful not to touch it, and examined the puddle. The water looked old, like it had been bleeding from underground pipes for years, but the concrete around it was dry. Only the immediate area beneath the door was wet. I checked every water source on B3 over the next 2 hours. Every pipe, every drain, every mechanical room I had access to. Nothing leaked. Nothing explained rust-colored water appearing from nowhere, from a door that my memory insisted hadn't been there yesterday. The radio crackled. My voice, 1 minute ahead, reported discovering an unmarked door. Reported the rust water. Reported the exact confused thoughts currently forming in my head, like someone was reading a script of my life before I lived it. I didn't tell the superintendent. What would I say? That the building was predicting my movements? That doors were appearing? He'd pull me from the night shift, maybe suggest I wasn't ready for solitary work, maybe make some calls about my previous situation. I needed this job. I needed the isolation, the routine, the mindless simplicity of cleaning empty spaces where nobody asked difficult questions. So I kept working. The door remained. Every night I'd pass it, and every night the rust water would be there, fresh and spreading, as if it had just started leaking moments before I arrived. I never touched the door handle. Some instinct, some primitive part of my brain that still understood predators and threats, told me that opening it would be a mistake. But the lights kept walking ahead of me, and the radio kept broadcasting my future. I started mapping it obsessively. I'd sketch out my route before each shift, noting every turn, every task, timing everything. Then I'd listen to the radio broadcasts and mark where they diverged from my plan. They never did. No matter how much I varied my routine, the voice stayed 1 minute ahead, describing with perfect accuracy everything I was about to do. It was during this mapping phase that I noticed something worse. The voice wasn't just describing my actions, it was describing my thoughts. Not obviously. Not like telepathy from cheap horror movies. But the check-ins would include observations that I'd mentally noted but never spoken aloud. The slight temperature drop near the archive room. The way footsteps sometimes echoed from empty corridors. The feeling of being watched that had become constant company on B3. I started keeping my thoughts neutral, clinical, focusing only on tasks and surfaces and schedules. But the broadcasts continued, and sometimes I'd hear in my future self's voice a tremor that suggested he knew something I didn't yet, had seen something I was walking toward. 3 weeks after the door appeared, I found the second one. Same hallway, same design. 15 feet west of the first, rust water pooling beneath it, fresh and impossible. Then a third door, the following week, a fourth, a fifth. They were appearing in sequence along the B3 corridor, all identical, all leaking that rust-colored water that came from nowhere and couldn't be mopped up, because by the next night it was fresh again, as if time reset for these puddles while the rest of the world moved forward. I started arriving earlier, leaving later, pushing the boundaries of the 6 a.m. departure rule. I needed to understand the pattern. The doors appeared roughly once a week, always on Thursday, always in the same corridor, marching westward toward the oldest part of the basement, the section that predated the university's expansion, that belonged to whatever structure had stood here before Hartwell bought the land in 1962. The radio broadcasts got worse. My future self started sounding stressed, then frightened, then resigned. The check-ins became shorter, the voice flatter, mechanical, like someone going through motions while something else happened in the background, something the words didn't describe but the tone couldn't hide. I tried leaving the radio in my locker, the building's speakers, the PA system that hadn't worked in 20 years, crackled to life and broadcast the check-ins anyway, my voice echoing through empty corridors from speakers that shouldn't have power. I tried changing my route entirely, working different floors. The lights still walked ahead of me, the doors still appeared, the rust water still spread. Whatever was happening wasn't about my presence. It was about the building itself. Some process that I'd become aware of but couldn't stop, like noticing your own heartbeat and being unable to unhear it. Last Tuesday, the 7th door appeared. I stood in front of it with my mop and bucket and radio, staring at the rust water, and realized I could hear something. Not through the door. That would have been simple, explicable, normal. I heard it through the radio, through the broadcast, my future self's voice describing the sound I was about to notice. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate. Not echoing from somewhere else, but coming from the broadcast themselves. From 1 minute in the future, walking through spaces I was about to enter. I turned off the radio. The PA system clicked on. I smashed the PA speaker with my mop handle. The emergency lights began pulsing in sequence. Morse code I couldn't read but somehow understood. The footsteps were getting closer, collapsing the gap between the future broadcast and the present moment. 30 seconds now. 20. 10. The lights went out. All of them simultaneously, killing the motion sensor sequence that had guided me for months. Complete darkness in a windowless corridor 3 floors underground, so absolute that I couldn't see my hand when I raised it to my face. My walkie-talkie, which I'd turned off, crackled back to life. But it wasn't my voice anymore. It was breathing, slow and wet and rhythmic. The breathing of something very large moving through narrow spaces. The motion sensors reactivated. 1 section, 2 sections, 3. Coming from the west, from the direction of the 7th door, from the oldest part of the basement where the original structure remained. The lights painted a path toward me, revealing empty corridor, empty corridor, empty corridor, then a shadow, tall enough that its head disappeared into the darkness above the fluorescent fixtures, thin enough that it seemed impossible for something that size to support itself. Moving with a gait that suggested too many joints in places joints shouldn't exist. I ran. The lights chased me. Not the guiding sequence that had led me through months of night shifts, but a hunting pattern, illuminating the corridor behind me in rapid pulses like a strobe, giving me fragmentary glimpses of the thing following. It moved impossibly fast for something so large, maintaining a distance that felt intentional, calculated, like a cat playing with prey it had already caught but hadn't decided to kill. I reached the stairwell. The door wouldn't open. Locked from the inside, which made no sense, which violated every fire code and safety regulation. But the handle wouldn't turn. The light stopped. I was standing in darkness again, pressed against a locked door, hearing that wet breathing getting closer. My radio crackled. My voice from 1 minute ahead said, "I understand now." The lights came back on, all of them simultaneously, revealing the corridor. Empty. No shadow, no figure. Nothing but scuffed linoleum and flickering fluorescence and 7 metal doors leading nowhere, rust water spreading from impossible sources. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. But there was something else. Rust-colored water staining my palms, dripping from my fingertips. I hadn't touched the doors. I hadn't touched the puddles. But my hands were wet with water that smelled like old iron and underground places, and when I tried to wipe them on my uniform, the water didn't transfer, didn't smear, stayed exactly where it was like a stain I'd been carrying all along. The radio spoke again. "The doors aren't appearing. They've always been here. We just weren't ready to see them until we'd walked this route enough times. Until we'd become predictable enough. Until we'd trained ourselves to follow the lights." I didn't remember pressing the talk button, but that was my voice. Present tense, not future. Speaking words I was thinking but hadn't said aloud. The stairwell door clicked open. I stood there, staring at the now unlocked exit, understanding with creeping horror that I had a choice. I could leave, call in sick, never come back. Find another job, another building, another night shift in some place where the lights didn't walk ahead of me. Or I could stay. Finish the shift, follow the pattern. Keep doing what I'd been trained to do through months of conditioning, following the light sequence like it was my purpose, my route, my reality. The fluorescence flickered in sequence. West, toward the 7 doors, toward the oldest part of the basement. 1 minute ahead of me, according to the radio, I was already walking that direction. My future self had made his choice, had followed the lights deeper into B3, toward whatever waited in the corridor beyond the 7th door, in the space that predated Hartwell University, that belonged to whatever had been here before. I looked at my rust-stained hands, at the open stairwell door, at the lights pulsing westward in patient, methodical sequence. The breathing started again. Not from the corridor this time, from inside my own chest. The wet, rhythmic sound I'd heard on the radio. The sound of something very large moving through narrow spaces. I touched my face. My fingers came away clean. But in the reflection of a polished metal pipe, for just a moment, I saw something else. Something tall enough that its head disappeared into darkness. Thin enough that it seemed impossible for something that size to support itself. The lights continued their sequence, waiting, guiding, and I realized with perfect, awful clarity, the building hadn't been predicting my movements. It had been showing me what I would become, what I was already becoming, what I'd been since the first night I followed those lights into the basement, accepting the isolation, the solitary routine, the mindless repetition that wore away whatever made me human, and replaced it with something that could walk these corridors forever, 1 minute ahead of itself, trapped in a loop that felt like free will, but was just the rails of a pattern I couldn't see until I was already committed. The radio crackled one last time. My voice, from some impossible distance, someplace 1 minute ahead or 1 year or 1 lifetime. Don't stay past 6. I checked my watch. 5:47 a.m. The rust water was spreading, not just from the doors anymore, but from everywhere, seeping up through the concrete, bleeding from the walls, rising in a slow tide that turned the corridor into something ancient and drowned and patient. The lights walked west, toward the 7 doors, toward the 8th door that I somehow knew would be there tomorrow, and the 9th the week after, and the 100th and the 1000th, doors appearing until the entire corridor was nothing but entrances to spaces that existed 1 minute ahead of now, 1 step deeper into whatever this place was becoming. I looked at the stairwell, at freedom, At the surface world where time moved forward and lights stayed still, and radios only broadcast what you told them to broadcast. Then I looked down the corridor, at my route, at the pattern I'd been following for 6 months, wearing grooves into my brain until the behavior became automatic, became identity, became the only thing I knew how to do. The lights pulsed, waiting, west. 5:51 a.m. I picked up my mop, adjusted my radio, started walking. Behind me, I heard the stairwell door lock itself. Ahead, the motion sensors activated in sequence, painting the path, showing me where I would go, where I was already going, where some version of me had gone 6 months ago when I first accepted this job and stepped into the basement and started following lights that had been waiting for someone predictable enough, broken enough, isolated enough to train. The 7th door stood open. The rust water flowed from inside like a river, and in its reflection, I saw myself. Not as I was, but as I would be. Tall and thin and moving with too many joints. Walking 1 minute ahead. Forever. I crossed the threshold. The door closed behind me with a sound like inevitability, and somewhere above, in the maintenance office, my replacement arrived for his first shift, accepting the walkie-talkie from the superintendent, learning his route, descending the stairs to B3 where the motion sensors would teach him how to walk, and walk, and walk, until walking was all he knew, all he was, all he would ever be. The lights flickered in sequence. West. Always west. 1 minute ahead, I was already there. 5:59 a.m. Story 8. The bell chimed at 3:03 a.m., and I knew immediately that something had changed. I'd been half asleep in the narrow bunk, wrapped in 3 layers of wool blankets that still couldn't quite keep the Alaskan cold from seeping into my bones. The sound cut through the darkness like a knife, brass against brass, clear and deliberate. Not the tentative jingle of wind or settling wood. This was the sound of someone opening a door. I sat up, my breath clouding in the beam of moonlight that sliced through the window. The temperature had dropped, not gradually, the way it does when the fire dies down, but suddenly, as if someone had opened the door wide and let the night pour in. My skin prickled with it, that specific bite of exterior cold, the kind that carries the smell of snow and pine and something older, something that predates human presence in these mountains. The door was closed, latched, exactly as I'd left it before climbing into bed 2 hours earlier. I stayed motionless, listening. The cabin made its usual sounds, the tick of contracting wood, the whisper of wind against the walls, the distant creak of ice on the lake. But there was something else now, something I couldn't quite identify. A presence, perhaps, or the absence of one. The air felt watched. After 10 minutes of straining into the darkness, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. A dream, maybe, or the bell responding to some imperceptible shift in the cabin's ancient frame. I was tired. The journey here had taken 3 flights and a 2-hour drive on roads that barely deserved the name, and I'd arrived at sunset with just enough light to haul my gear inside and get the fire going. Exhaustion could play tricks. I lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. The cold had settled into the room like a house guest who refuses to leave, and beneath that, threading through the ordinary sounds of the night, I could swear I heard something else. Dripping, slow and irregular, like melting snow. When dawn finally dragged itself over the mountains, I found the first puddle. It sat near the door, a dark comma of water on the rough-hewn floorboards. As I approached, I realized it wasn't shapeless. There was a pattern to it, an arc, a heel, the suggestion of toes, half a footprint, facing the door, as if someone had stood there with one wet boot, contemplating the exit. I crouched beside it, my knees cracking in the silence. The wood around it was bone dry. There was no trail leading to it, no wet marks anywhere else in the cabin. Just this single half-print, already beginning to shrink as the dry air claimed it. My hand hovered over the water, close enough to feel the cold rising from it. Some instinct stopped me from touching it. Instead, I stood and checked the door again. Still latched. The handle showed no moisture, no indication that anyone had touched it with wet hands or boots. Outside, the snow lay perfect and unmarked, a white page that held no story at all. My own tracks from the previous evening led from the driveway to the door and nowhere else. The morning was crystalline and still, the kind of cold that makes sound travel strange distances. I could hear the lake ice groaning, a deep bass note that felt more than heard. The nearest cabin was a quarter-mile east, set back in a stand of black spruce. Smoke rose from its chimney, gray against the pale sky. I'd noticed it when I arrived, had felt some comfort in knowing I wasn't completely alone out here, though alone was exactly what I'd come for. 3 weeks of solitude. Time to think, to reset, to escape the grinding noise of the city and the questions I couldn't answer there. I went back inside and made coffee on the propane stove, watching the puddles slowly disappear. By the time I'd finished my first cup, it was gone completely, leaving only a faint darkness on the wood that might have been my imagination. The fishing hole was a 10-minute walk, a circle of open water kept clear by a small aerator someone had installed years ago. The hole sat at the end of a short pier that extended onto the frozen lake, and I'd set up there yesterday evening, drilling through the remaining ice at the edges to widen it, arranging my rod and bucket in the small folding chair that would be my throne for the coming weeks. I spent that first full day watching my line, feeling the cold work its way through my layers, listening to the silence. It wasn't really silence, of course. The lake sang constantly, pops and groans and long, eerie moans as the ice shifted and expanded. Birds called from the distant shore. The wind created its own language in the trees. But there were no human sounds, no engines, no voices, no electronic hum. Just the world doing what it had done for millennia before we arrived and would continue doing long after we were gone. I caught 2 good-sized pike before the light failed. The fight they put up felt honest, straightforward. Pull, resist, yield. Simple cause and effect. I kept one for dinner and released the other, watching it vanish into the dark water with a flick of its tail. As I walked back to the cabin in the gathering dusk, I noticed the smoke from the neighboring cabin had stopped. The structure sat dark against the trees, its windows blank. I wondered if anyone was actually there or if I'd been seeing old smoke, the remnants of a fire from earlier in the day. That night I set my fishing rod at a precise angle against the wall near the door, 30 degrees, the tip pointing toward the window. I didn't know why I did it. Some impulse, some need to mark my space, to know if anything changed while I slept. The bell woke me at 3:03 a.m. This time I was certain. I'd been deeply asleep, dreaming of water, and the sound pulled me up through layers of consciousness with the clarity of an alarm. The door's bell, ringing once. The same rush of cold air, sharp and immediate. The same sense of something having just happened, an action completed in the instant before I woke. I turned on the flashlight and swept it across the cabin. The beam caught my fishing rod, standing exactly where I'd placed it. 30 degrees. Tipped toward the window. Not moved a fraction of an inch. But there were puddles now. 3 of them, arranged in a line from the door to the rod and back. Half prints, all facing the exit. As if something had walked in, adjusted my rod to precisely the angle I preferred, and walked back out. My chest tightened. The air seemed to thicken, pressing against my ribs. I got out of bed slowly, every sense hyper-alert, and checked the door. Latched. The floor around the puddles was dry. No wet trail. No explanation. I stood there for a long time, flashlight beam steady on those impossible marks, watching them slowly evaporate. The cold gradually receded, the temperature creeping back up to merely frigid rather than exterior Arctic. By the time I worked up the nerve to check outside, the puddles were gone. The snow told the same story as before. Nothing. No one. Just my tracks, leading nowhere but to and from my fishing hole. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the chair by the stove, feeding it split logs, watching the shadows dance across the walls. When dawn came, I felt hollowed out, my thoughts moving through mud. Over breakfast, instant oatmeal that tasted like cardboard, I tried to rationalize it. Old cabin, strange acoustics. the temperature differential creating condensation in weird patterns, my exhausted mind imposing order on random watermarks, the bell moving on its own as the building settled. None of it felt true, but the alternatives felt worse. I spent the morning fishing, catching nothing, my line hanging motionless in the black water. The lake ice groaned and cracked around me, and I found myself watching the shoreline, the tree line, the horizon, looking for something I couldn't name. Movement that shouldn't be there. Stillness that felt wrong. Around noon, I saw someone walking along the eastern shore. He moved slowly, bundled in a dark parka, picking his way between the trees. For a moment, I felt a surge of relief. Another person, someone I could talk to, someone who might explain the oddities of this place. But as I raised my hand to wave, he stopped and turned, and something about his stillness made my arm fall back to my side. We stood like that, separated by 100 yards of frozen lake, watching each other. Then he continued walking, disappearing into the spruce stand where the neighboring cabin sat. That evening, I walked to his place. The trail between our cabins was obvious once I looked for it. A slight depression in the snow, as if many feet had packed it down over time. His cabin was smaller than mine, older, the logs dark with age and weather. No smoke rose from the chimney. No light showed in the windows. But I could sense occupation, that indefinable feeling of a space being inhabited rather than abandoned. I knocked. The sound seemed too loud, too aggressive against the silence. When no one answered, I knocked again, then called out. My voice died quickly in the cold air, swallowed by the forest. The door opened. He was older than I'd expected, his face weathered into deep lines, eyes pale as ice. He studied me for a long moment before speaking, and when he did, his voice carried a strange accent I couldn't place. Something northern, Scandinavian maybe, softened by decades of English. "Evening," he said. Just that, an acknowledgement. I introduced myself, explained I was renting the cabin to the west for a few weeks, wanted to introduce myself as a neighbor. The words felt stupid as I said them. Too formal, too city-mannered for this place. He nodded slowly, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. "The fishing good?" We talked for a few minutes about pike and trout, about the lake and the weather and the best spots along the shore. Normal conversation, the kind neighbors have. But there was something underneath it, some current I couldn't quite catch. He stood in his doorway the whole time, never inviting me in, never stepping out. The interior of his cabin remained dark behind him. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. "You hear anything at night?" I stopped, turned back. "What kind of anything?" "The bell, maybe. Sounds." His pale eyes held mine. "Things that don't quite make sense." My mouth went dry. "Yes." He nodded, as if this was expected. "It's been coming here longer than either of us. Longer than this cabin, probably. Longer than the one you're in." He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "If you want to stay, leave the way out clear. Don't block the door. Don't jam it shut at night. It needs to know it can leave." What needs to leave? But he was already closing the door, that weathered face receding into shadow. "Just keep the way clear," he said. And then I was alone on his porch. The forest pressing close, the temperature dropping as the sun touched the mountains. I walked back in the fading light, his words echoing in my head. It needs to know it can leave. What kind of advice was that? What kind of thing needed reassurance about exits? That night, I moved my pack away from the door. I'd been using it as a draft stopper, a rolled-up barrier against the cold that seeped under the gap. Now I pulled it aside, leaving a clear path from door to interior. I felt ridiculous doing it, felt like I was participating in some kind of superstitious ritual, but I did it anyway. I also set my fishing rod at 30 degrees again, tipped toward the window. A test, a measurement, some way to know if I was losing my mind or if something was actually happening. Sleep came hard and shallow, full of half-dreams about water and cold and footsteps I couldn't quite hear. I kept waking, checking the clock. 1:47, 2:23, 2:51. Each time feeling more alert, more certain that something was building toward that specific moment. At 3:03, the bell rang. I was already awake, staring at the ceiling, when the sound came. Clear, deliberate, impossible. The cold rushed in like a living thing, and I heard it this time. Not just the temperature change, but something else. A sound like water dripping onto wood. Rhythmic, patient. I didn't move, couldn't move. Some animal instinct had locked my muscles, flooded my bloodstream with the understanding that stillness was survival. I lay there, heart hammering, breath held, listening to those slow, wet sounds cross my cabin floor. Drip, drip, drip. Moving from the door toward my rod, stopping, then returning. Drip, 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 moving back toward the exit. The cold began to recede. The dripping stopped. The bell chimed once more, softly, and the temperature started its slow climb back to merely freezing. I waited 10 minutes before I dared to move. When I finally turned on the flashlight, my hands were shaking so badly the beam jerked across the walls like a trapped bird. The puddles were there, more of them now, a clear path from door to rod to door, half prints, all facing the exit, and my rod stood exactly where I'd placed it, at precisely 30 degrees, tipped toward the window. But the wood around its base was slightly wet, as if someone had handled it with dripping hands, checking it, adjusting it, ensuring it remained perfect. I got dressed in the dark, piling on every layer I had. Then I sat in the chair by the stove and fed the fire, watching those puddles slowly disappear, waiting for a dawn that felt impossibly far away. The sun rose eventually, it always does. The puddles vanished, the cold stabilized. The cabin returned to normal, or what passed for normal in this place. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that bypasses logic, that nothing would ever feel normal again. Over the next week, the pattern established itself with mechanical precision. Every night at 3:03, the bell would ring. The cold would rush in. The wet footsteps would cross my floor, always checking my rod, always returning to the door. And every morning I would wake exhausted and rattled, questioning my own senses. I stopped fishing. Couldn't bring myself to sit out on that frozen lake, my back to the vast emptiness, knowing something visited my cabin while I slept. Instead, I stayed inside, watching the clock, dreading the hours after midnight. I tried staying awake through it once, sat in the chair with the flashlight in my hand, determined to see whatever was happening. But as 3:03 approached, I felt a weight pressing down on me, a crushing exhaustion that seemed to come from outside my body. My eyes closed, despite every effort to keep them open. When I jerked awake, gasping, it was 3:07. The puddles were already there, already evaporating. I'd missed it again. The isolation began to work on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Days bled together. I'd come here for silence, for solitude, and now I had too much of both. The quiet pressed against my eardrums. The emptiness felt deliberate, malevolent. I started talking to myself, narrating my actions just to hear a human voice. Making coffee now, the water's boiling. That's good, that's normal. Walking to the window, looking outside, snow's still there, trees are still there, everything's where it should be. But was it? The longer I stared at the landscape, the more uncertain I became. Were those trees in the same positions as yesterday? Was the shoreline the same distance? Did the neighboring cabin look darker somehow, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth? I thought about leaving, thought about it constantly. But something kept me there. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness, or something else. Some growing need to understand what was happening, to force the world to make sense again. On the 9th night, I left a note. It felt insane even as I wrote it, my handwriting shaky in the lamplight. But I was desperate for any kind of communication, any acknowledgement that something was actually happening beyond my own deteriorating mind. "Who are you?" I wrote. "What do you want?" I left it on the floor beside my fishing rod, weighted down with a stone. Then I went to bed, wondering if I'd crossed some line, if there were rules about addressing the impossible. The bell rang at 3:03. I lay rigid in the darkness, every nerve screaming, as the cold poured in and the wet steps crossed my floor. I heard them pause, a longer pause than usual, right where I'd left the note. Then they continued, checked the rod, and returned to the door. When I checked in the morning, the note was gone. In its place was a puddle, larger than the others, shaped almost like a hand reaching toward where the paper had been. And my rod stood perfect, 30 degrees, tipped toward the window, as it had every morning. But there was something else, a smell, faint but distinct, threading through the cabin's usual scent of wood smoke and pine. Lake water, that specific mineral tang of deep, cold water, the kind that never sees sunlight. I stood there for a long time, staring at that hand-shaped puddle, feeling something shift inside my chest. Not fear, exactly. Something deeper, more fundamental. A recognition, perhaps, that I was not the primary resident here, that I was the guest, the temporary occupant, tolerated only as long as I observed the rules. Keep the way clear. That afternoon, I walked to my neighbor's cabin again. He opened the door before I could knock, as if he'd been waiting. In the daylight, he looked older than before, or maybe more tired. His eyes held a kind of patient sadness. "You want to know what it is?" he said. Not a question. "Yes." He stepped aside, finally inviting me in. The interior was neat, sparse, everything in its place. But there was that smell again. Stronger here. Lake water, old water, water that had been still for a very long time. "No one knows," he said, settling into a chair by his stove. "I've been coming here for 40 years, and my father came before me." He said his grandfather told stories about it. Something that lives in the lake, maybe, or something that used to be in the lake and can't quite let go. He paused, feeding a log into the fire. Or maybe it's the lake itself, trying to understand us. Trying to understand why we come here, what we're looking for. "It takes my note," I said. "It arranges my things. It tries to participate." His voice was soft. "That's the worst part, I think. It's not hostile. It doesn't want to hurt you. It wants to help in its way. Wants to be useful. But it doesn't understand living the way we do. It only understands water and cold and waiting." I felt something loosen in my chest, some tight coil of fear unwinding. "So I'm not crazy." "No." He met my eyes. "But staying might make you that way. Most people leave after a few nights. The ones who don't..." He trailed off, looking toward his window, toward the lake beyond. "They get used to it. Start waiting for it. Start needing that sound at 3:03, that proof that they're not alone, that something knows they're here." His words hung in the air between us. Outside, the light was fading again, the brief winter day surrendering to night. "How long are you staying?" he asked. "I don't know anymore." He nodded slowly. "Just remember, keep the way clear. Let it know it can leave. That's the important part. It has to believe it can leave." Walking back to my cabin in the twilight, his words echoed through my mind. It has to believe it can leave. Not me. It. Whatever came at 3:03. Whatever walked with wet steps across my floor. Whatever arranged my things with such careful precision. It needed to know the exit was open. But why? What was it leaving behind? Or what was it afraid of staying? That night I sat by the window and watched the clock. The numbers glowed green in the darkness. 2:47, 2:53, 2:59. My heart rate climbed with each passing minute. At 3:02, I held my breath. The bell rang, but this time I didn't close my eyes, didn't turn away. I sat perfectly still and looked toward the door. The handle didn't turn. The door didn't open. But the cold came anyway, rushing in as if the walls themselves had become permeable. And in that cold, in the moonlight slanting through the window, I saw something. Not a shape exactly, not a shape. More like the absence of light, a density in the air that suggested form without confirming it. It moved from the door toward my rod with that familiar dripping sound, and I understood suddenly that I wasn't hearing footsteps. I was hearing water falling from something that held water the way cloth holds dye, inherently, essentially, as part of its fundamental nature. It reached my rod, paused, and for one terrible, eternal moment, I felt it notice me noticing it. The temperature plummeted, the windows creaked with sudden frost, and then it was moving back toward the door, faster than before, the dripping becoming a cascade, a rush, water that had forgotten how to fall one drop at a time. The bell chimed again. The cold receded, the pressure in my chest released. I sat there for the rest of the night trembling, watching the puddles form and fade, understanding with absolute clarity that I had violated some unspoken agreement. I had looked. I had seen. I had acknowledged what was never meant to be acknowledged. When dawn came, I began to pack. My hands shook as I rolled up my sleeping bag, as I gathered my supplies, as I dismantled my careful arrangements. The fishing rod fell over, and I left it where it lay. The angle didn't matter anymore. Nothing mattered except leaving, getting out, returning to a world where doors opened when handles turned and footsteps required feet. But as I reached for the door, I stopped. The handle was wet. I pulled my hand back, staring at the water dripping from my fingers. The door was closed, latched, but the handle was soaked, as if it had been gripped by something just moments before, or was being gripped right now, from the other side. I stood frozen, my pack heavy on my shoulders, my breath coming in short gasps. Outside, through the window, I could see my car in the driveway, 50 feet away. Might as well have been 1,000 miles, because I understood now what my neighbor had meant, what he'd been trying to tell me without saying it directly. It needs to know it can leave, not might leave, not could leave if it wanted to, needs to, has to, as if something were compelling it, driving it to seek the exit again and again, checking and rechecking that the way remained clear. But what if the thing it was trying to leave wasn't the cabin? What if it was the lake? What if, every night at 3:03, something crawled out of that dark water and dragged itself to the nearest structure, the nearest promise of walls and warmth, seeking refuge from whatever waited in those depths? And what if, finding the door clear, it reluctantly returned, night after night, back to the cold and the dark and the endless waiting? Or worse, what if it was trying to tell me something, showing me the way out, checking my gear, making sure I understood the path from door to tools to door, preparing me for the moment when I would need to know that route by heart, when seeing wouldn't be possible? My hand reached for the handle again, touched the wet metal, felt the cold that went deeper than temperature, that spoke of places where warmth had never existed. I could leave, should leave, but something had shifted in me during those long nights, during those patient visits, during that moment when I'd looked and been looked at in return. Some understanding had formed, wordless and deep. We were both trapped here, both caught between the water and the world, both checking the exits, making sure the way stayed clear, preparing for an escape we might never make. I took my hand off the handle, removed my pack, set my fishing rod back against the wall, carefully, precisely. 30 degrees, tipped toward the window. Outside, the snow remained perfect and unmarked. Inside, the puddles from the night before had finally disappeared, leaving only the faintest darkness on the wood. Soon even that would be gone, and no evidence would remain of the visitor who came when the world was sleeping. But tonight, at 3:03, the bell would ring, and I would be here, waiting. Not because I understood what visited me, not because I'd stopped being afraid, but because I'd realized, somewhere in the darkest part of the night, that leaving the way clear wasn't just about the door. It was about accepting that some things need to move between worlds, need to test the boundaries, need to know that passage remains possible even when we can't see where it leads. And that the greatest courtesy we can offer the unknown isn't understanding or explanation, it's simply keeping the way clear. The clock reads 2:47 p.m. now. Outside, the winter light is already fading. surrendering to the long Alaskan night. My neighbor's cabin sits dark and quiet across the snow. The lake ice groans and cracks, singing its ancient song. In 15 hours and 16 minutes, the bell will ring. And I'll be here, still wondering if I'm the one being visited, or if I'm the one visiting something that was here long before me, and will remain long after I'm gone. Still wondering if the wet footprints face the door because something is leaving, or because something is showing me the way out, again and again while it still can. Story 9. The elevator stops at the 4th floor every night at 2:22 a.m., but the doors never open. I know this because I've been awake to hear it. The mechanical hum rising through the building's bones, the gentle ping of arrival, then silence. No footsteps in the hallway, no doors opening or closing. Just that pregnant pause before the elevator descends again, leaving the 4th floor in darkness. I live in 4B4, have lived here for 3 months now, ever since the consulting firm transferred me from Chicago. The apartment came furnished, which should have been my first warning. Nobody leaves a perfectly good apartment furnished unless they're in a hurry to leave. The doorbell rings at 2:26 a.m. 4 seconds, exact. I've timed it. The first night it happened, I jolted awake, heart hammering against my ribs. By the time I stumbled to the door, fumbling with the chain lock, the hallway was empty, but the air tasted metallic, sharp on the back of my tongue, like the moment after lightning strikes too close. Ozone. I've lived in cities my entire adult life. I know what ozone smells like after a summer storm, after old electrical wiring sparks behind a wall. This was different, cleaner somehow, more deliberate. The second night, I was ready. I positioned myself by the door at 2:20 a.m., hand on the deadbolt. When the doorbell rang, I yanked the door open in less than a second. Empty hallway, but the smell was stronger, concentrated directly outside my door. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, twice. In that stuttering illumination, I thought I saw something at the end of the corridor, near the elevator. A shadow that didn't quite match the furniture. But when the light steadied, there was nothing. I installed a video doorbell the next day. The landlord, a thin man named Chen, who spoke in clipped sentences, seemed surprised when I called to inform him. "Camera," he said. There was a pause on the line. "Is there problem?" I explained about the doorbell, keeping my tone casual. "Just a precaution," I said. "Living alone, you know how it is." He made a noise that could have been agreement or concern, then hung up without another word. The camera arrived 2 days later. High resolution, night vision, motion detection. I spent an hour mounting it, making sure the angle captured the full width of the hallway. That night, I sat in my living room with my laptop open, watching the feed, 2:22 a.m. The elevator pinged. I watched the screen, 2:26 a.m. The doorbell rang, and I felt it through the door like a physical thing. 4 seconds. On the screen, nothing. No movement in the hallway. No figure approaching my door. Just empty corridor and that damn flickering light. But something was wrong with the perspective. I watched the recording 3 times before I understood what my brain was trying to tell me. The hallway looked shorter. Not dramatically, not enough to notice unless you were looking for it. But the distance from my door to the elevator seemed compressed. Maybe an inch. Maybe 2. The potted plant that old Mrs. Chen keeps by the stairwell door appeared closer than it should have been. I measured it the next morning. 68 feet from my doorframe to the elevator. I wrote it down in my phone, added it to a note file I'd started keeping. Evidence, I told myself, though I wasn't sure of what. That week, sleep became theoretical. I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds until 2:22 a.m. My body learned to anticipate it, adrenaline flooding my system minutes before, leaving me jittery and nauseated. The consulting job suffered. I showed up late to a client meeting, forgot to file a report. My supervisor sent a concerned email that I archived without responding. On the seventh night, I decided to wait in the hallway. I dragged a chair from my apartment at 2:15 a.m. and positioned it directly across from my door. The building was silent except for the ambient sounds of old infrastructure, pipes groaning, the distant hum of the HVAC system. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes shadows look darker by contrast. 2:22 a.m. The elevator pinged. I watched the indicator lights. Fourth floor. The number glowed orange behind scratched plastic. The mechanism engaged, that familiar grinding of gears and cables, but the doors remained closed. I could hear something beyond them, though. A sound like breathing, wet and rhythmic. Then it stopped. Silence flooded back. I became aware of my own pulse, too fast, too loud in my ears. The hallway stretched before me, longer than it should have been. Or was it? I couldn't tell anymore. The potted plant seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking directly at it, moving incrementally closer like a predator in tall grass. 2:26 a.m. My doorbell rang. I was sitting 15 feet away, staring at my own door. Nothing touched it. No hand, no figure, no shadow. The button pressed itself, and I heard it ring inside my apartment with crystalline clarity. 4 seconds. I counted. The ozone smell rolled over me in a wave, so strong it made my eyes water. The lights dimmed, then brightened, then settled into a queasy pulsing rhythm, and in that stuttering illumination, I saw it. The hallway was wrong. The walls weren't parallel. They converged slightly toward my door, subtle enough that you'd never notice in steady light, but visible now in the flickering. And the floor, I realized with crawling horror, sloped. Just a fraction of a degree, tilting downward toward 4B. I stood up. The chair scraped against linoleum with a sound like a scream. The elevator pinged again. 4th floor, but it was 2:27 a.m. Wrong time. Wrong sequence. The doors opened. Nothing came out. Just darkness, absolute and complete, as if the elevator shaft led somewhere that light couldn't reach. I stared into it, and something stared back. Not with eyes, because there were no eyes. But I felt its attention lock onto me like a physical weight, pressing against my chest, stopping my breath. I ran, crashed through my apartment door, slammed it shut, turned every lock. Then I stood there gasping, back against the wood, listening to my heartbeat slowly return to something resembling normal. I checked the camera feed. The recording showed me sitting in the chair, standing up, walking calmly back into my apartment. No running, no panic. The elevator doors remained closed throughout, but in the timestamp, there was a gap. 4 seconds missing between 2:26:00 and 2:26:05. The file jumped, seamless except for the metadata. The next morning, I inspected my door frame while sunlight streamed through the hallway windows, making everything seem absurdly normal. The wood looked old, original to the building probably, painted over dozens of times. But there were fresh marks near the strike plate. Scratches, thin and precise. And the screws holding the frame to the wall, they were loose. I touched one. It spun easily, barely catching the threads. Every screw was the same. Someone had removed them recently, then replaced them, hastily, judging by the stripped threads. But it was the direction that made my stomach turn. The screws had been twisted inward, from the hallway side, forced into the frame as if the wood was trying to push into my apartment. I called a locksmith. He arrived that afternoon, a compact man with careful hands and reading glasses perched on his nose. He examined the frame for a long time without speaking, running his fingers along the wood grain, testing the hinges. "This is strange," he finally said. He pointed to the strike plate. "See how the metal is stressed here? Like something's been pushing from both sides simultaneously. Shouldn't be possible with a standard door frame." I asked him to replace everything. New frame, new door, new locks. He quoted me a price that made me wince, but I agreed immediately. He said he'd return tomorrow with materials. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my living room with all the lights on, watching the camera feed on my laptop. 2 screens, actually. I'd set up a second camera inside, pointed at my front door. 2:22 a.m. The elevator pinged. On the external feed, I watched the hallway. Empty. Normal. But the internal camera showed something different. My door was shaking. Not violently, just a subtle vibration, as if something on the other side was running its hand along the surface. Testing it. Learning it. 2:26 a.m. The doorbell didn't ring. Instead, I heard scratching. Deliberate. Methodical. The sound of metal on wood. I muted my laptop's speakers, but I could still hear it, transmitted through the door itself. Scraping, digging, persistent. It lasted 4 seconds, then stopped. On the camera feed, nothing. The hallway remained empty, but the ozone smell seeped under my door, thick enough to taste. The lights in my apartment dimmed, and I realized with creeping horror that it wasn't the bulbs failing. Something was absorbing the light, drawing it inward like breath. The scratching resumed, not on the door this time. Inside the walls, moving through the building's infrastructure, circling my apartment. I tracked it by sound, pressing my ear against the drywall in different rooms. It was everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the hollow spaces between floors, traveling through pipe chases and electrical conduits. Then I understood. It wasn't trying to get in. It was already inside. Had always been inside. The building itself was the mechanism, and I'd been living within it, oblivious until some threshold was crossed. Some boundary violated by my presence. The walls began to sweat. Condensation formed in perfect vertical lines, as if the building was crying. I touched one line, brought my fingers to my nose. No scent, just cold water. But when I pulled my hand away, the moisture clung to my skin in threads, viscous and wrong. I grabbed my phone, wallet, keys. I'd leave, go to a hotel, figure this out in the morning when the sun was up and logic prevailed. But when I reached for the deadbolt, my hand stopped inches away. The screws in the frame were turning, slowly, methodically, tightening themselves. I watched one complete a full rotation, then another, sinking deeper into the wood. The door was sealing itself. I yanked at the knob. Locked. But I hadn't locked it. I never lock it from the inside. The deadbolt turned under my palm, metal grinding against metal, engaging with a finality that felt intentional. The elevator pinged. 4th floor, 2:28 a.m. Wrong time again. Through the peephole, I could see the hallway. It was longer now, impossibly long, stretching away into a vanishing point that shouldn't exist in a building this size. The fluorescent lights extended into the distance, a corridor of illumination that bent at the edges like a fisheye lens. And at the end, something stood beside the elevator. I couldn't see it clearly, not because of distance or poor light, but because my brain refused to process its shape. It existed in my peripheral vision, gone when I tried to look directly at it. But I felt it watching me through the door, through the wood and metal and my skull, seeing something inside me that I didn't know was there. The doorbell rang. 4 seconds. But I was looking through the peephole. I saw what pressed the button. It was a finger. Just a finger, disembodied and pale, extending from the boundary between the door and frame. Not from behind the door or in front of it, but from within the seam itself, emerging from a space that shouldn't contain anything. It pressed the button with careful precision, then withdrew into the impossible gap, leaving behind the smell of ozone and something else. Something organic and ancient. I backed away from the door. The camera feeds on my laptop showed nothing unusual. Empty hallway, closed door. But the timestamp was wrong on both feeds now, flickering between numbers that didn't form coherent time. 2:26, 2:22, 2:28, 2:24, cycling through possibilities. My apartment began to shift, subtle at first, the angle of the walls changing by degrees, the ceiling pressing lower, or maybe the floor rising to meet it. Space compressing like film in a projector, frames overlapping until past and present existed simultaneously. I saw myself in the kitchen, making coffee, though I was standing in the living room. I saw myself sleeping in bed, though I was wide awake. Multiple versions of the apartment occupying the same footprint, bleeding through the boundaries of now. The scratching resumed, not on the walls this time, but in the air itself, as if something was scratching at the membrane of reality, trying to tear through from whatever existed on the other side. The locksmith arrived the next morning. I don't remember the night ending, don't remember the transition from 2:28 a.m. to 8 a.m. Just a gap in my memory, smooth and seamless, like the missing 4 seconds in the camera footage. He replaced the door frame. It took 3 hours. I watched him work from my couch, drinking coffee that tasted like copper, listening to his small talk about the weather, the traffic, his daughter's soccer tournament. Normal words in a normal world that felt increasingly fictional. When he finished, he stood back to admire his work. "Solid as a rock now," he said. That old frame was practically held together by paint. I thanked him, paid him, watched him leave. The new frame looked identical to the old one. Same measurements, same wood grain. But the screws were different. Bright and silver, catching the hallway light. I measured the distance to the elevator that evening. 67 feet, 3 inches. The hallway had shortened by 9 inches. I moved my measurements to a spreadsheet, tracking them obsessively. Every morning, first thing, I'd pace the distance with a tape measure. The hallway continued to compress. An inch here, half an inch there. Some mornings, it would spring back, returning to its original length as if nothing had happened. But the overall trend was inward, toward my door. Mrs. Chen in 4C noticed me measuring one morning. She watched from her doorway, arms crossed over a faded robe. "You feel it too," she said. Not a question. I asked her what she meant. She stared at me for a long moment, then shook her head and retreated inside. But before her door closed, I caught a glimpse of her apartment. The walls were covered in symbols, drawn in what looked like chalk or paint. Circles within circles, angular shapes that hurt to look at directly. I started researching the building's history. Built in 1928, renovated in the 80s, then again in 2003. Nothing unusual in the records, no deaths, no tragedies. Just a standard residential building in a quiet Boston neighborhood. But there was a gap in the ownership records. Between 1952 and 1954, the building didn't appear in any municipal documents. Taxes unpaid, utilities disconnected, as if it simply didn't exist for those 2 years. Then it reappeared in 1955 under new management, with no explanation for the absence. I found one article in a digitized newspaper archive. Small piece, buried in the back pages. December 1951. 3 tenants reported missing from the building. Police investigated, found no signs of foul play. The missing persons were never located. Their apartments, all on the 4th floor, were found sealed from the inside. The article didn't provide names or apartment numbers, just the detail that the missing tenants had all complained about unusual noises in the weeks before their disappearance. Mechanical sounds, they said, like gears turning inside the walls. I hear the gears now, faint but persistent, especially at night. The building is a machine, I've come to understand. Some kind of mechanism built for a purpose I can't fathom, and I'm caught in its workings, a piece ground slowly between teeth I cannot see. The doorbell stopped ringing a week ago. I almost miss it. At least it was predictable, something I could anticipate and prepare for. Now there's just silence at 2:26 a.m., thick and expectant, like the building is holding its breath. The hallway measures 62 feet as of this morning. My door is 6 feet closer to the elevator than when I moved in. The landlord doesn't return my calls. Mrs. Chen's apartment is empty, cleared out overnight without a sound. I should leave. I know I should leave. But when I try to pack, my hands won't cooperate. They move like they're underwater, slow and uncoordinated. And when I approach the door, ready to walk out and never return, I find myself stopping, standing there with my hand on the knob, unable to turn it. Something is keeping me here. The camera feeds show different versions of the hallway now. In one it's day, in another night, in another Sometimes the walls are different colors, or the carpet is missing, replaced by bare concrete. Sometimes there are doors that shouldn't exist, numbered in sequences that make no sense. 4B1, 4B7, 4BX. I appear in some of the feeds, standing in the hallway, facing my own door. I'm wearing clothes I don't recognize, my face gaunt and unfamiliar. In one feed, I'm screaming silently. In another, I'm laughing. In most, I'm just standing there, perfectly still, staring at the camera with eyes that look like mine but aren't. The elevator opened again last night. 2:22 a.m. This time, I walked to it. I don't remember deciding to walk. My body simply moved, pulled by invisible threads, crossing the threshold of my apartment into the hallway. The corridor was longer than it should have been and shorter than it was, both simultaneously. Space had become negotiable, a concept rather than a constant. The potted plant was behind me and ahead of me. The elevator was close and impossibly distant. Inside the elevator, I could see the fourth floor button. It was glowing orange, pressed in, but I was already on the fourth floor. The button shouldn't be lit, unless this wasn't the fourth floor anymore, not the one I'd been living on. I reached the elevator threshold. The darkness beyond the doors was absolute, but I could hear something inside. Machinery, yes, but also breathing. The wet, rhythmic sound I'd heard before. And beneath that, words. Spoken in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. Calling my name. My real name. Not the one I use, but the one underneath. The designation of what I am, rather than who I am. The sound my existence makes in whatever medium consciousness moves through. The doors began to close. I had seconds to decide. Step back into my hallway, my apartment, my life, or step forward into whatever waited in that manufactured darkness. I stepped back. The doors closed. The elevator descended. I listened to it travel down through the building, cables singing in their shafts, until the sound faded into the structural groaning of old concrete and steel. When I turned around, my apartment door was open. I don't remember opening it. The interior looked different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint what had changed. Same furniture, same layout, but the light fell differently, shadows pooling in corners that should have been bright. I'm writing this now because I need to document it before it slips away. Memory has become unreliable. Time refuses to maintain consistent direction, and I'm no longer certain which version of my apartment I'm occupying. There might be dozens of them, stacked like pages, and I'm bleeding through from one to another. The sun is rising. I can see it through the window, pale light filtering through frost that shouldn't exist in September. Or is it September? The calendar on my phone says November 5th, 2025, but I don't remember October happening. The hallway measures 60 feet exactly as of 7:42 a.m. My door frame has new screws again. I didn't replace them. They're the old ones, the ones the locksmith removed, twisted inward, forcing themselves back through holes that had been filled. Tonight is another night. 2:22 a.m. will come again. The elevator will arrive at a floor that exists in the space between floors, and my doorbell might ring, or it might not. Or it might have always been ringing and I'm only now beginning to hear it. I think I understand now. The building isn't haunted. The building is hunting. Patiently, methodically, using time as a snare. And I've been caught since the moment I signed the lease, struggling against loops that tighten with every attempt to break free. The question isn't whether I'm losing my mind. The question is whether I ever had it to lose. Or if sanity is just another measurement that's been shifting while I wasn't paying attention, compressed like the hallway, turned inward like the screws, folding into itself until the distinction between true and false becomes meaningless. I've stopped measuring the distance to the elevator. The numbers don't matter anymore. All that matters is the sound of gears turning in the walls, patient and eternal, grinding toward whatever conclusion this mechanism was designed to produce. And the certainty, growing stronger each day, that the fourth floor has never been empty at 2:22 a.m. I'm the one who's been absent, waiting in some anteroom of existence while the real fourth floor continues without me. And now, finally, I'm being invited to attend. to step through whatever door opens when all the measurements align and the building completes its calculations. The doorbell will ring tonight. Or it won't. The elevator will arrive at 2:22 a.m. Or it already has. Countless times. And this is just one iteration among many. Either way, I'll be here. Because I don't think I can be anywhere else anymore. The hallway has been shortening by exactly 4 inches per week. By that calculation, my door will touch the elevator in approximately 22 days. What happens then? I don't know. Maybe the mechanism completes. Maybe I finally understand what I've been moving toward since the day I arrived. Or maybe the 4th floor resets, finds a new tenant and begins the process again. Over and over. Forever. The apartment feels smaller than it did yesterday. Or maybe I'm getting larger, expanding to fill the available space as the space itself contracts. It's hard to tell the difference anymore. I've started seeing the finger at other times now, not just at 2:26 a.m. It emerges from seams I never noticed before. Between the floorboards, where the ceiling meets the walls, in the gap beneath the refrigerator, always pale, always deliberate, pressing and testing and measuring. Sometimes I press back. I put my finger against the seam, meeting it halfway. The contact is cold, colder than anything has a right to be, and in that moment of touching, I see through to the other side. A place where geometry follows different rules, and the 4th floor extends infinitely in directions that don't have names. That's where I'm going. That's where we all go. Eventually. Everyone who signs a lease and unpacks their boxes and lies down to sleep in an apartment that was furnished when they arrived. The only question is whether we go willingly or fighting. I haven't decided yet. The sun is setting now, I think. The light outside has that golden quality that usually means evening, but it could just as easily be dawn. Time has become circular, or maybe spiral. Hard to tell from inside the mechanism. The screws in my door frame are turning again, tightening. Soon it will be 2:22 a.m., and the elevator will arrive at the 4th floor, where it stops every night but never opens. Except tonight, I think it will open, and I think this time, I'll understand why. Story 10. The radio crackled at 2:47 a.m., and I knew something was wrong before the voice even came through. I'd been working night security at the Bayside Industrial Shipyard for 8 months, long enough to know the rhythm of silence that settles over Tampa Bay after midnight, the kind of quiet that feels thick, almost tangible, broken only by the occasional groan of moored vessels and the distant hum of the interstate. But that night, the silence felt different, heavier, like it was waiting for something. The handheld radio sat on the desk in front of me, its green display glowing softly in the darkness of the security office. I'd been scrolling through my phone, trying to stay awake through another shift, when static burst from the speaker. Dispatch, this is Unit 7. Running plates on a silver Accord, Florida tag. The voice paused, and I heard papers rustling. JKM 4739. Vehicle parked near the south gate, no movement observed. I sat up straight, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio, even though I hadn't keyed the mic. Unit 7 hadn't existed for 3 years. The company had downsized from 4 patrol units to just 2, and I was the only one on duty tonight. The other guard, an older guy named Patterson, worked the perimeter check from 10 to 2 before heading home. But that wasn't what made my skin prickle. JKM 4739. I knew that plate. It belonged to one of the foremen, a barrel-chested man who always parked his silver Accord in the same spot near the administrative building. He'd arrive tomorrow morning around 6:30, same as always. Not tonight. Never at night. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, stepping out into the humid Florida air. The shipyard stretched before me in shades of gray and black, massive cranes looming like skeletal giants against the clouded sky. Sodium lights created pools of sickly orange glow at regular intervals, but between them, the shadows seemed absolute. The smell of salt and diesel fuel hung thick, mixing with something else, something almost like ozone before a storm. The south gate was a 10-minute walk from the main office, past rows of shipping containers and through the maintenance yard. My footsteps echoed off metal surfaces, each sound seeming to travel farther than it should. I kept the radio clipped to my belt, its static hiss a constant companion. No more voices came through, but I could feel it there, alive somehow, waiting to speak again. When I reached the south gate, the silver Accord wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. The parking area was empty except for a rusted pickup that had been abandoned near the fence line months ago. But as I swept my flashlight across the asphalt, the beam caught something that made me stop. Tire tracks. Fresh ones, still gleaming with moisture, as if a vehicle had just pulled away moments before. The rest of the lot was bone dry, dust coating everything in a fine layer of grit. But these tracks were wet, water beating on the black surface, running in thin rivulets toward the storm drain. I knelt down, playing the light over them. They started in the middle of the lot, appeared out of nowhere, and traced a path toward the exit before simply ending about 15 feet from the gate. No gradual fade. They just stopped. As if the car had been lifted straight up into the air, the radio on my belt burst to life again. Unit 3 to dispatch, I've got a blue F-150, tag number HRT8821, parked outside the loading dock. Looks like someone left their lights on. Should I check it out? Unit 3. Another ghost. I'd never even met whoever used to patrol under that designation. According to the logs I'd found in the filing cabinet, Unit 3 had been decommissioned back in 2019, and HRT8821. That was Patterson's truck. But Patterson had left hours ago, hadn't he? I keyed my radio, my thumb trembling slightly against the button. Dispatch, this is current patrol. Can you confirm Unit 3's status? Silence. Just the soft crackle of static, like waves against a distant shore. I started walking toward the loading dock, my pace faster now, the flashlight beam jumping nervously ahead of me. The shipyard felt different than it had earlier, as if the spaces between buildings had stretched somehow, making familiar routes feel foreign. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, probably just the wind pushing trash across the pavement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was pacing me, staying just out of sight. The loading dock came into view, a concrete platform extending from the main warehouse. And there, parked at an angle with its headlights cutting through the darkness, sat Patterson's blue F-150. The lights were on, just like the radio voice had said. The engine was running. I could hear it idling, see the faint shimmer of exhaust in the cool air. But Patterson didn't work this shift. He'd gone home at 2. I'd watched him drive away, waved as he passed the gate. I approached the truck slowly, my hand resting on the radio. The driver's side door was open, interior light illuminating an empty cab. Coffee cup in the holder, still steaming. Clipboard on the passenger seat with tonight's date written at the top. Keys in the ignition. Patterson? My voice sounded small, swallowed by the ambient hum of machinery and distant water. You still here? No answer. I walked around the truck, checking the bed, the surrounding area. Nothing. Just the truck, running, lights on, as if someone had gotten out intending to return in seconds and then simply vanished. I reached in and turned off the ignition, pocketed the keys. The sudden silence was worse than the engine noise had been. In the quiet, I could hear my own breathing, too fast and shallow, and beneath it, something else. A rhythmic sound, like footsteps on metal, coming from inside the warehouse. The radio crackled again, louder this time. All units, this is Unit 5. I'm seeing movement in Sector 12, near the dry dock. Possible intruder, requesting backup. Unit 5, another phantom. Sector 12 was on the far side of the shipyard, near the water's edge where the old dry dock facility sat empty and rusting. No one had worked there in years. The company had fenced it off, declared it unsafe after the last hurricane had cracked the foundation and flooded the lower levels. I stood there in the darkness, Patterson's keys cold in my palm, trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to get back to the office, lock the door, and call the real dispatch, the one that existed in the present. But something else pulled at me, a need to understand what was happening, to follow these impossible voices to their source. The walk to Sector 12 took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of jumping at every sound, of feeling eyes on my back, of resisting the urge to run. The radio stayed silent except for the occasional burst of static, but I could feel it building, like pressure before a storm breaks. The air smelled wrong now. Too much salt, too much moisture, as if the bay had crept closer while I wasn't looking. The fence around the dry dock had been cut. Recently, from the look of it, the chain link peeled back to create a gap just wide enough for a person to slip through. I stood at the opening, flashlight pointed into the darkness beyond. The old dry dock was a concrete pit, 60 feet deep, with rusted crane tracks running along its edges. Stairs descended into the basin, disappearing into shadows that my light couldn't quite penetrate. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. If there was an intruder, announcing myself was probably the worst possible approach. But if there wasn't, if I was chasing ghosts and phantom radio calls, then who was I really talking to? The radio on my belt hissed, then cleared. "Dispatch, area clear, all quiet in Sector 12, heading back to the office." My own voice, but I hadn't keyed the mic. I grabbed the radio, stared at it, my hands suddenly shaking. That was my voice, my exact cadence, even the slight rasp I got when the humidity bothered my throat. But I hadn't said those words. Not yet. I looked at my watch. 3:14 a.m. The radio crackled again, and this time, beneath the static, I heard something else. Water. The sound of waves, gentle and rhythmic, like someone was transmitting from the beach. But we were inland, surrounded by industrial equipment and concrete. The bay was a quarter-mile away. Then, cutting through the white noise, a laugh. Short, sharp, unmistakably human. But it wasn't my laugh. It was close, though. Similar enough to make my skin crawl, like hearing a recording of your voice played back through broken speakers. I backed away from the fence, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. The shipyard around me seemed to pulse, shadows deepening and receding in rhythm with my racing heart. I needed to get back to the office, needed to document this, call someone, maybe go home and pretend this shift never happened. But as I turned to leave, my light caught something on the ground near the fence. Footprints, fresh ones, pressed into the thin layer of dust and grime that coated everything. They led from the gap in the fence, walked in a small circle, then headed back toward the interior of the shipyard. My footprints, my boot treads, I recognized the pattern from the isthmus I'd noticed on the right sole, but I hadn't walked through yet. I was still standing at the entrance, looking in. The radio hissed again and I heard my own voice, distant and distorted. "Dispatch, this is current patrol. Area is clear, requesting permission to..." The transmission cut out, replaced by that same sound of water, that same wrong laughter. I ran. Not a measured retreat, not a tactical withdrawal, but a full sprint through the shipyard, my flashlight bouncing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rational part of my mind tried to assert control, tried to explain what I was experiencing as equipment malfunction, atmospheric interference, stress hallucinations from too many night shifts. But the deeper, older part of my brain, the part that still remembered why humans feared the dark, was screaming at me to get out, get away, that something fundamental was broken here. I made it back to the office, slammed the door behind me, and locked it with trembling hands. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m. I'd lost half an hour somewhere between the dry dock and here, time slipping away like water through my fingers. The radio on my desk, my primary unit, was transmitting. The green light blinked steadily, indicating an open channel. I reached for it, pulled my hand back, reached for it again. Silver Accord, Florida tag JKM 4739. Vehicle parked near the south gate. No movement observed. Unit 7. The same call from earlier, but slightly different this time. The voice was clearer, closer. I could hear breathing between words, hear the small sounds of movement as whoever was speaking shifted in their seat. Blue F-150, tag number HRT8821, parked outside the loading dock. Lights on, engine running. No sign of the driver. Unit 3, playing out the scene I'd just witnessed, describing it as it happened, but in the past tense, as if it had already occurred before I arrived. Movement in Sector 12, near the dry dock. Multiple contacts, possible. The transmission dissolved into static, then cleared again. Water sounds, waves. Getting louder now, as if the ocean was flooding through the radio speaker, filling the small office with its presence. And then, my own voice, perfectly clear. Dispatch, this is current patrol. Area is clear. Over. I picked up the radio, my hand surprisingly steady now, and keyed the mic. Time to close the loop. Time to say the words I'd heard myself say. Dispatch, area clear, all quiet, over. The response came immediately. My voice echoed back at me through a wall of static. Copy that, patrol. See you tomorrow night. Same time, same place. The radio went dead. Not just silent, but completely powered down, the green display fading to black despite fresh batteries. The office lights flickered once, twice, then stabilized. Outside, the shipyard returned to its normal nocturnal quiet, the oppressive weight in the air lifting like morning fog. I sat there until my shift ended at 6, watching the clock, watching the windows, waiting for something else to happen. But the rest of the night passed without incident. Patterson's truck was gone when I checked the loading dock at first light, as if it had never been there at all. The tire tracks near the south gate had dried and disappeared, just dust and old asphalt. The foreman arrived at 6:30, parking his silver Accord in its usual spot. I filed my report as all quiet, no incidents. What else could I say? That I'd been chasing ghosts through the shipyard? That I'd heard myself on the radio before I'd spoken? That somewhere, in some other frequency, other patrols were still making their rounds through a version of this place that no longer existed? That night, when I came back for my next shift, the radio crackled to life at exactly 2:47 a.m. Dispatch, this is Unit 7, running plates on a silver Accord, Florida tag JKM 4739. I listened to the whole sequence play out again, every call in the same order, at the same times, and I realized, with a certainty that felt like ice in my chest, that tomorrow night it would happen again. And the night after that. A loop, playing over and over, with me trapped somewhere in the middle, both observer and participant. The worst part isn't the phantom voices or the impossible tire tracks or the way time seems to fold in on itself here. The worst part is that I've started to hear new calls. Voices I don't recognize yet, reporting plates and positions that won't be real for hours or days or maybe years. And sometimes, late in my shift, when the radio fills with that sound of distant water and wrong laughter, I wonder if I'm the ghost now, if I'm the one transmitting backward through time, warning myself about things that have already happened. Tomorrow night, I'll come back to work. I'll sit in this office and wait for 2:47 a.m. I'll listen to Unit 7 call in the silver Accord, to Unit 3 report Patterson's truck, to Unit 5 see movement at the dry dock, and then I'll hear myself, voice clear through the static, saying the words I haven't spoken yet, closing a loop I don't remember starting, trapped in a frequency that exists somewhere between what was and what will be. The radio is already starting to crackle, even though it's powered off. I can hear it from here, that familiar hiss building beneath the silence. I think it's waiting for me to key the mic, to complete the circuit, to say the words that will lock me into this pattern forever. But the worst part, the part that keeps me frozen in my chair, staring at the dark display panel, is that I can't remember if I've already done it, if this is my first loop or my 100th, if I'm still warning myself, or if I've already become the warning. Outside, the shipyard waits in darkness. Inside, the radio hisses its song of salt water and echoed time. And somewhere, on a frequency I can't quite tune out, I can hear myself laughing. Not yet, but soon, very soon. Story 11. The map lied. Not about the trail itself. The dotted line on the laminated paper matched the coordinates well enough. But what it didn't show What no topographic survey could capture was the absence. Where the old railbed should have been, where cross ties and ballast stones ought to mark decades of industrial history, there was only earth. Compressed earth, yes. Two parallel depressions running through the forest floor like the memory of something heavy. Something that had carved its route and then vanished, taking every physical trace with it except the wound it left behind. I'd been hiking the backwoods of North Carolina for 3 days when I found it. This ghost of infrastructure cutting through a section of the Appalachians that the recreational trails avoided. The kind of place that made you understand why the old-timers talked about these mountains like they were alive, like they remembered things. The afternoon light came down in shafts through the canopy, illuminating clouds of pollen that hung in the air like suspended snow. My boots found the depression almost by instinct, my right foot sinking slightly deeper than my left as I crossed what the map insisted was an abandoned railway spur, decommissioned in 1952. I stopped, crouched down, ran my fingers through the dirt. No rust flakes, no splinters of treated wood, no ballast gravel, just soil, and those two grooves, perfectly parallel, running off into the trees in both directions. The forest had grown up around it, but never quite over it. The trees leaned away, their roots avoiding the space where rails had been. I followed the depression north for maybe half a mile before the light started to fade, marking my return path with small cairns of stones every 100 yards or so. The temperature dropped faster than it should have as the sun sank, and I found myself walking quicker, though I couldn't have said why. Just that the silence felt heavier here, the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, that presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the crunch of every footfall amplified in the absence of any other sound. I made camp a quarter-mile east of the railbed, far enough that I could tell myself I wasn't thinking about it, close enough that I could still see the depression through the trees when I sat up in my tent. The fire caught easily, dry hickory that I'd collected from a dead fall, and I sat watching the flames while I ate cold beans from a can and tried to ignore the way the darkness beyond the firelight seemed to have texture, seemed to move just at the edge of perception. That's when I heard it. A crack, sharp and clear, like wood splitting under pressure. Then another, and another. A rhythm to it, almost metronomic. The sound of railroad ties settling under weight, except there were no ties, no weight, nothing but empty forest and those two grooves in the earth. I stood up, my hand automatically going to the knife on my belt, though what good a blade would do against sound I couldn't have said. The cracking continued, moving from north to south along the railbed, each snap marking progress, something heavy and invisible making its way through the dark. And underneath it, barely audible, a whistle. Not a train whistle, too organic for that, too wavering, more like someone pursing their lips and blowing, the note rising and falling, growing closer. My throat felt tight. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to listen past the thunder of my pulse. The whistling stopped. The cracking stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was somehow worse, pregnant with expectation, with the sense of something waiting just beyond the reach of my firelight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back against a pine tree, the fire built up higher than necessary, watching the railbed. Twice I thought I saw movement, a darker shadow among shadows, too tall and too angular to be natural. Both times I convinced myself it was nothing, just trees and exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But my hands shook when I poured coffee from my thermos at dawn, and I broke camp faster than I ever had before. I should have left. Should have packed everything up and hiked back to the nearest fire road, back to cell service and other people, and the comfortable certainty of the ordinary world. Instead, I found myself walking back to the railbed, drawn by something I still can't adequately explain. Curiosity, maybe, or something deeper than that. Some instinct that insisted I needed to understand what I'd heard, what I'd almost seen. The morning sun made everything look less threatening. Birds called in the canopy overhead. The first I'd heard since entering this section of forest. A squirrel chattered angrily at me from a low branch. Normal things, daylight things. I followed the railbed south this time, moving faster now, my eyes scanning the ground for anything that might explain the sounds from the night before. I found the marker after 20 minutes of walking. A length of reflective flagging tape, the kind trail maintenance crews use, tied around a young oak about 10 feet from the rail bed. Bright orange, impossible to miss. I stopped, stared at it. I hadn't put it there. I'd been alone since leaving the last shelter 2 days ago. Hadn't seen another hiker in that time. But as I got closer, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. The tape wasn't just tied around the tree. It had been carefully arranged, wrapped and crossed in a deliberate pattern. When I stood directly in front of it, the pattern resolved into numbers. 3:47. A time. Someone had used reflective tape to mark a specific time on a tree in the middle of nowhere. I pulled out my phone. No service this deep, but the clock still worked. 11:23 a.m. Whatever significance 3:47 was supposed to have, I was nowhere near it. I took a photo of the marker, trying to capture the way the tape caught the light, though I wasn't sure who I'd show it to or why. The act of documentation felt important, felt like something that might keep this experience tethered to the real world. The smart thing would have been to leave the marker alone, to hike out and chalk the whole experience up to some weird local prank or trail ritual I didn't understand. The smart thing would have been to trust the unease sitting heavy in my gut, that ancient part of the brain that knows when something is wrong even if it can't articulate why. I came back at 3:47. The forest was different in the afternoon. The light had that golden quality peculiar to autumn, slanting in at an angle that made every leaf glow like stained glass. I'd spent the intervening hours in a kind of fugue state, unable to commit to leaving, unable to think about anything except that marker and what might happen if I stood there at the appointed time. I'd tried to nap and couldn't, tried to eat and nearly gagged on dry trail mix. My hands trembled, though whether from anticipation or dread I couldn't distinguish. At 3:40, I positioned myself in front of the marked tree. The rail bed stretched away to my left and right, those twin depressions cutting through the forest like scars. The air was still, that peculiar stillness that comes before a storm, though the sky was cloudless. My watch ticked through the minutes with excruciating slowness. 3:43, 3:44, 3:45. At 3:46, the temperature dropped. Not gradually, a sudden plunge that raised goosebumps across my arms and sent my breath misting in front of my face. I could see frost forming on the fallen leaves around my boots, spreading out in crystalline patterns that caught the light. 3:47. The first thing I noticed was the sound of my footsteps. I wasn't moving, was standing perfectly still, but I could hear boots on gravel. My boots, my gait, the distinctive scuff crunch pattern I'd learned to recognize over years of hiking, but delayed. The sound came a full 2 seconds after I shifted my weight, an echo that had somehow gotten disconnected from its source. The second thing I noticed was the rail bed. The depressions were still there, still empty. But now I could see them more clearly, could see the way the air above them shimmered like heat distortion, could see something moving in that shimmer. Shapes, suggestions of shapes. Too vague to describe, too present to dismiss as imagination. I took a step forward. 2 seconds later, I heard myself take that step. The disconnect was nauseating, like watching a movie with the audio out of sync. The cold intensified, cutting through my jacket, making my teeth chatter. The shimmer over the rail bed grew stronger, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I saw it clearly. A train. Not a modern train, not even a steam engine. Something older, something that looked like it had been assembled from memory and shadow. The cars were there and not there, occupying space without displacing it, and I could see through them to the forest beyond, even as I could see every detail of their construction. There were no passengers, no crew. Just empty cars rolling past on invisible rails, heading south with terrible purpose. The cold was unbearable now. My lungs ached with every breath. The delayed footsteps continued even though I'd stopped moving, an echo of motion that hadn't happened yet or had already happened, I couldn't tell which. Time felt loose here, unmoored from its normal progression. And then I saw the tree, the one marked with reflective tape, except now there was something carved into its bark, letters cut deep and recent. Don't wait for the last. I hadn't seen that before. I was certain I hadn't seen it before. The letters were crude but deliberate, each one gouged out with force. A warning, a message. From whom and about what, I couldn't begin to guess. The phantom train continued its silent passage. I counted 7 cars before my nerve broke and I stumbled backward, away from the railbed, away from the cold and the temporal distortion, and the impossible sight of something that couldn't exist, but was undeniably there. The moment I crossed some invisible threshold, warmth returned like a physical blow. The delayed footsteps aligned with my movement. The shimmer over the railbed faded, taking the ghost train with it. I ran, not my finest moment, but honest. I crashed through the underbrush, my pack bouncing against my back, branches whipping at my face. I didn't stop until I'd put a full mile between myself and that marked tree. Didn't stop until I collapsed against a boulder with my lungs burning and my legs shaking. When I could finally breathe normally again, I pulled out my phone and looked at the photo I'd taken of the marker. The carved message was there in the image, clear as anything. Don't wait for the last. But I knew, I would swear on anything, that the bark had been smooth when I'd taken that picture. The carving had appeared later, or earlier, or existed in some space between times, only visible when conditions were right, when someone was foolish enough to stand in the appointed place at the appointed hour. I should have left then, should have hiked through the night if necessary, gotten back to civilization and put the entire experience behind me. But the message, don't wait for the last. The last what? The last train? The last time? The last person to find this marker? As the sun set on that second night, I made camp even farther from the railbed, but the questions wouldn't stop circling in my mind. I'd seen something, experienced something, and whatever warning that message contained, I'd already violated it by being there, by observing, by participating in whatever temporal anomaly or supernatural phenomenon or collective hallucination was playing out in this forgotten corner of the mountains. The cracking sounds started again after dark, the phantom splitting of railroad ties that didn't exist. But this time they were closer, much closer, and they weren't following the railbed. They were moving through the forest, circling my camp in a tightening spiral. The whistling came with them, that organic, wavering note that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing, just darkness and those sounds, growing nearer with each passing moment. My fire seemed dimmer than it should be, its light not reaching as far, as if the dark itself was pressing in, condensing. That's when I saw them. Figures. Standing just beyond the firelight, perfectly still. Too tall, too thin, their proportions wrong in ways that my brain couldn't quite process. They didn't move, didn't speak. They simply stood there, watching, waiting, observing me the way I'd observed the phantom train, caught in my own appointed moment. I scrambled backward, nearly falling into the fire. The figures didn't advance, didn't retreat. They maintained their vigil, patient as stones, and behind them, weaving through the trees, I could see more of that shimmer, that distortion in the air. The railbed had moved, or I had, or space itself had folded in ways that put me back in proximity to whatever ran those invisible tracks. The cold returned. The temporal displacement. My movements echoed seconds later, and I could hear other footsteps now. Dozens of them, all out of sync. A cacophony of delayed sounds that suggested I wasn't alone in experiencing this thing, that others had stood where I stood and felt what I felt, and maybe, just maybe, hadn't made it out. One of the figures moved. A subtle shift, but unmistakable. It was closer than it had been a moment before, though I hadn't seen it approach. The others remained motionless, but that one was advancing, and I understood with sudden, crystalline clarity that I'd exceeded my allotted time, that the 3:47 marker had been a boundary, a safe window for observation, and by returning to camp, by staying in this section of forest, I'd indicated my willingness to witness more, to become part of whatever schedule the phantom trains ran on. "I'm leaving," I said aloud, my voice strange and thin in the distorted air. "I'm leaving now." The figure stopped. The others didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my words in any way. But the one that had been advancing held its position, and after a moment that stretched far too long, it stepped backward, melting into shadow. I didn't pack my gear. I grabbed my flashlight, my knife, my water bottles, and I walked. East, away from the railbed, away from the figures, moving fast but not running, because some instinct told me that running would trigger something, would mark me as prey. The delayed footsteps continued for half a mile, then gradually aligned, then stopped entirely. The cold lifted. The forest sounds returned. Normal sounds, cricket songs and the rustle of nocturnal animals, and the sigh of wind through the canopy. By dawn I'd reached a fire road. By mid-morning I'd flagged down a ranger's truck. I told him I'd gotten turned around, that I'd lost my gear to a bear, lies that came easily because the truth was impossible. He drove me to the nearest town, to a motel with Wi-Fi and other people and the blessed mundanity of traffic noise and television and all the sounds of human civilization. I stayed there for 3 days before I could bring myself to look at my phone, to scroll through the photos I'd taken. The marker was there, the carved warning, but there were other photos too, ones I didn't remember taking. Images snapped at odd angles, showing the rail bed at different times of day, in different lighting. And in the background of several barely visible, those figures, standing, watching, waiting. The last photo in my camera roll was taken at 3:47 a.m. on my final night in the forest, hours before I'd fled to the fire road. The timestamp was clear, indisputable. In the image, I could see my tent, my dying fire, and a figure standing directly over where I'd been sleeping. Its face, if it had a face, was turned toward the camera, toward some future version of myself that would look at this photo and understand that I'd been granted a reprieve, that I'd been allowed to leave when others might not have been. The carved message haunts me. Don't wait for the last. I think I understand it now. There's a schedule, a timetable that governs whatever runs those phantom rails. Times when observation is safe, when you can witness without participating, and other times, later times, when the windows close and you become part of what you're watching, when your footsteps join the cacophony of delayed echoes, when you stand motionless at the edge of someone else's firelight, too tall, too thin, waiting for the next train to wherever it is those tracks lead. I don't know if what I experienced was real. Don't know if those figures were ghosts or echoes or something else entirely, something that doesn't have a name in our limited vocabulary. I don't know if the temporal distortions were genuine, or if 3 days alone in the mountains had fractured something in my perception, if isolation and suggestion had combined to create an elaborate hallucination. What I do know is this: I won't go back. I won't return to that section of forest, won't seek out that rail bed or try to solve the mystery of what happened there. Because whether it was real or not, whether those figures exist or I conjured them from loneliness and fear, the experience changed something, opened something, and I have the terrible suspicion that if I return, if I stand at that marker again at 3:47, I won't be granted another reprieve. The trains run on their schedule. The figures maintain their vigil. And somewhere in the North Carolina mountains, the railbed continues its impossible existence, waiting for the next hiker who finds a map that lies, who hears the cracking of phantom ties, who sees reflective tape arranged into a time they don't yet understand. Don't wait for the last. I didn't. But I wonder, sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, about those who did, about whether they're still waiting there, caught in that temporal loop, watching new visitors with eyes that have forgotten how to blink, their proportions stretched by time or space or something worse, about whether the next person who finds that marker will see me among them, too tall, too thin, standing at the edge of their firelight, about whether I've already become what I witnessed and just don't know it yet.